I remember the first time I saw something like this on TV. It was one of those long investigative stories about people disappearing while hiking, the kind that make your stomach tighten and your eyes unwillingly follow every frame. In this case, it was an older woman hiking the Appalachian Trail. She wasn't some reckless teenager or a thrill seeker. She was careful, meticulous even. She planned her route, checked in at stopping points, and told her husband she'd call him when she reached the next shelter. But that call never came. Mid-morning, she had left the previous shelter alone. That was the last anyone saw her. The story followed the search that went on for years. Her husband contacted the authorities as soon as he realized she hadn't called. Search teams scoured the area, volunteers combed the trail, and cadaver dogs were brought in. They checked shelters, campgrounds, and even sections of the trail where the slope dropped sharply into thick underbrush. They talked to everyone who had been on the trail that day, trying to reconstruct her path. One man and woman had spent the night at a shelter the night she passed through, and she had left alone before they did. The searchers interviewed them carefully, but there was nothing unusual about her departure. She seemed fine, normal, and alone, moving at her usual pace. Another man had been in the shelter the night before she passed through. He was alone, quiet, unremarkable, and never gave anyone a reason to be suspicious. He wasn't following her, and he wasn't a threat. The search teams confirmed this, checking his movements, talking to people along the trail. They pieced together a timeline. She left mid-morning, hiking at her usual speed, and vanished somewhere along a stretch of the trail that was steep and heavily wooded. They searched the area repeatedly, over weeks, months, and even years. In winter, the snow covered the ground, making it impossible to track footprints or disturb vegetation. They returned in spring, following every lead, examining every slope and bush, scanning with drones, and even thermal imaging at times. But cadaver dogs couldn't detect her. There were rumors, assumptions, minor sightings that never checked out. Every lead ended in frustration. Eventually, someone found her. Not a rescue team, not a tracker, but a hiker following a different section of the trail weeks after the official search had stopped. She had fallen down a steep incline, somewhere no one thought to check because it looked impossible to navigate. She landed in the middle of a large bush, hidden from view from above or from the trail. Her death was immediate. From what investigators could piece together, she had a heart attack or some kind of sudden medical episode while hiking, lost her balance, and tumbled down. The fall itself didn't kill her, but the combination of the episode and the uncontrolled descent put her in that hidden spot. When they found her, the body was remarkably preserved in the thicket, the bush cradling her in a way that almost seemed like nature itself had swallowed her whole. Her family finally had closure. There was nothing sinister, nothing malicious, nothing left unsaid. The search teams could explain the gaps, the missed sightings, the impossible terrain. It was the kind of ending that was quiet and painfully real, a reminder that nature doesn't bend to our schedules or expectations. It was over. They marked the spot, cleared the area for hikers to pass safely, and her husband was able to grieve with some sense of resolution, even if the grief was profound and permanent. A different case I saw later echoed the same eerie, quiet realism, though the circumstances were even more unsettling. A skeleton was found in a desert, hidden in a bush for around 3 years. Local authorities were called in after a passerby spotted bones partially exposed from sand erosion. They arrived cautiously. The scene was strange. Next to the skeleton was a .44 revolver under the chin and a few capped PVC pipes laying nearby. They treated it as potentially dangerous, suspecting a bomb. The bomb squad came and examined it. They quickly confirmed that the pipes were harmless. A rail bomb would require metal components, detonators, or explosives, not just empty PVC. Inside the pipes, they found identification: a birth certificate, a student ID from a local college, and a driver's license that had expired years earlier. The records confirmed that he had been reported missing the exact same time authorities had lost track of him. He had disappeared from college without explanation, and no one had any idea where he had gone. Investigators concluded that he had likely died by suicide. the revolver in his hand and the meticulous placement of the pipes suggesting that he had planned it carefully. He had chosen a remote, hidden spot where he could not be disturbed for years. The isolation, the meticulous detail, the secrecy, it was all unervingly deliberate. In both cases, there were no ghosts, no monsters, no imagined horrors. Just human bodies, lives abruptly ended, lost to terrain or circumstances that were too easily overlooked. The endings were quiet, final, and realistic. The Appalachian Trail hiker fell down a slope and was hidden by the bush that covered her. The desert man chose a hidden bush to end his life, leaving behind only his identification in capped pipes. Both stories are the kind that linger because they are not dramatic in the supernatural sense. They are terrifying because they are real. They are terrifying because someone can vanish completely from the world in a way that leaves no immediate explanation, no chase, no confrontation, just a long, cold passage of time before the truth is uncovered. And in both cases, the closure, when it finally came, was sobering. Families and authorities could understand what had happened. There was no ambiguity about foul play or imagined threats, only the quiet, unavoidable finality of death in remote, unforgiving environments. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are true, that involve no monsters, no villains, just the unpredictable intersection of human frailty and the vast, indifferent wilderness. These stories stuck with me because they felt personal. They weren't abstract fears. They were real people who vanished and were later found, their lives ending in a way that made sense only when every piece of evidence was examined carefully. There is a cold clarity to that kind of terror, a stark reality that no ghost or fairy tale could ever match. It is the knowledge that a single misstep, a single sudden medical episode, or a deliberate choice to vanish can erase a life from the world completely, leaving only traces in the land itself, traces that might never be found. Or if they are, they bring a quiet, unshakable truth rather than a storybook ending. The Appalachian Trail woman's body was removed and laid to rest by her family. The desert man's remains were returned to his relatives. In both cases, the land returned to its quiet indifference, the trails and deserts moving on as if nothing had ever happened. And the people left behind were forced to reconcile with the simple, unsettling reality that life can end quietly, invisibly, and finally, far from anyone's eyes, leaving only the faintest imprint in memory in the land itself. I set out early that morning with the sun, just brushing the mountaintops. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the sharp smell of pine and wet earth. The trail was quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch under my boots. I had been hiking for hours, pushing steadily through the Maine wilderness, following the familiar markers of the Appalachian Trail. The forest stretched endlessly, dense and unyielding, and it was easy to feel both small and alive in the vastness of it. I carried my pack, heavy but necessary, loaded with the supplies that had got me this far: freeze-dried meals, small stove, water purification tablets, extra layers. Every step I took was deliberate, measured. Every footfall reminded me that one misstep could mean trouble. At first, the trail was straightforward, deceptively calm. But the further I went, the wilder it became. Sections of the path were overgrown, moss carpeting the rocks, hiding roots that threatened to trip me. I knew this area of Maine was notorious for turning even experienced hikers around. The thick woods created a maze of green, and the occasional fog that rolled in made it impossible to see far ahead. My map and compass were out at all times. I checked them regularly, even though I was confident in my sense of direction. Years of experience had taught me that nature demands respect and attention. Arrogance could be fatal. Midway through the afternoon, I reached a clearing where I could see a distant ridge. The view was breathtaking. I could almost forget the isolation, the constant tension that being alone in this wilderness demanded. I took a moment to rest, removed my pack, and drank from my water bottle. I checked my supplies again, making mental notes of what I had left for the next day. Then nature called. I stepped off the trail to relieve myself, moving a short distance into the trees. The forest closed in around me, and the trail behind me disappeared from sight, swallowed by the thick underbrush. I thought I would be back in a minute. I never realized how quickly a small misstep could spiral into a life-threatening situation. The first sign of trouble was subtle. I turned back toward the trail, but the landmarks I had counted on were gone. The moss-covered rocks I had passed, the tree with the split trunk I had noted earlier, none of them matched my memory. Panic did not hit immediately. At first, I tried to reason it out. I retraced my steps carefully, marking the ground as I went. I followed a small ridge, hoping it would lead me back. Hours passed, and the sun began to lower, cutting the forest into long, dark shadows. The temperature dropped faster than I expected, and my confidence began to fade. Every direction looked the same. Every tree, every shadow seemed to mock my attempts to find a trail. I kept moving, forcing myself not to sit down. I had trained for endurance, for survival in tough conditions, but even that experience felt fragile in this wilderness. I rationed my water carefully and ate sparingly, knowing that conserving energy was critical. Night came without warning. The forest transformed into a wall of darkness, every sound amplified. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, the distant sound of running water. My body was exhausted, my mind desperate. I huddled under a fallen tree, trying to conserve warmth, using my backpack for insulation. I wrote in my journal by the faint light of a headlamp, documenting each step I had taken, each wrong turn, each thought. Writing became a lifeline, a way to maintain some order in the chaos. The days blended together. I found small streams, collecting water, but food was scarce. I had planned to survive a week on what little I carried, but miscalculations and exhaustion meant that even that was dwindling rapidly. I left notes for anyone who might find me, small scraps of paper in waterproof containers, in case searchers came close. I recorded thoughts, observations, instructions for my family, words of goodbye. Hunger gnawed at me relentlessly. Each day, my body weakened, my steps slower, my mind foggier. The forest seemed endless, indifferent to my struggle, stretching on in every direction without giving any hint of the trail's location. I survived longer than I expected. Days turned into weeks, and I learned to move carefully, to conserve energy, to stay hydrated and protect myself from the cold. I rationed my body's remaining strength, walking only when I had to, sleeping when I could. My journal entries became more reflective, less about directions and more about the experience itself, the immense solitude, the raw power of the wilderness. The forest demanded everything from me, my patience, my endurance, my understanding. And still, I pressed on, determined not to surrender completely, hoping that someone would find me before it was too late. Eventually, it became clear that my journey would not end on the trail. My body weakened beyond what I could recover from, and exposure and hunger took their toll. I found a small hollow among the trees, dry and sheltered, and there I stayed. I wrote my final notes, my goodbyes, instructions for those who would someday come across them. I tried to make peace with the inevitability, reflecting on every mile I had hiked, every challenge I had overcome, every triumph of my spirit. My story would not be one of a lost, frail hiker, but of someone who had faced nature with courage, who had endured as long as any human could in complete isolation. Months later, my body was found less than a mile from the trail I had strayed from. The search had been massive, but the forest had hidden me, and my determination had kept me moving far longer than anyone could have expected. My diary and notes survived, a testament to both my skill and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. The story of my disappearance was not one of weakness, but of resilience, of a lone human against the immense, indifferent power of the wild. And in the end, even though I did not make it back to the trail, my journey stood as a reminder of both the beauty and the danger of the world beyond civilization. I worked as a forest ranger for nearly a decade in some of the most remote parts of the national park system, and even with all the strange things I've seen, there's one place that has never left my mind. It's tucked into a section of the park that's almost impossible to reach, a rugged climb of jagged rocks and dense pines that seems to exist entirely on its own, isolated from any trail or road. The park had a small camp there, built from logs and rough-hewn sticks, used only in emergencies or by small teams working in the area. Most rangers avoided it unless absolutely necessary because the place had a reputation that no one could explain, and after what I heard about it, I understood why. The first story that stuck with me involved a small group stationed there for a week-long patrol. They had pitched tents and made a small fire, just enough for cooking, and for the first night, everything seemed normal. Then, well past midnight, the sound started. At first, they thought it was a bear or some other predator, but what came across the gorge was unlike anything they had heard before. Deep, guttural bellows that shifted in pitch in ways that no animal could reproduce. Two distinct patterns, almost like a call and response, bounced from rock to rock. One was low and throaty, vibrating so strongly it made the ground feel like it was humming. The other was higher pitched, sharp and cutting, like metal being scraped across stone. The team tried to make sense of it, comparing it to every animal they knew in the region. Nothing fit. Even the grisliest bear or the howls of wolves didn't match. One of the rangers grabbed a recorder, thinking maybe they could analyze it in the lab later, but the sound was so alien they left a tangible sense of fear in the campsite. The team huddled near the fire, trying to convince themselves it was a trick of echoing rocks, but the tones were too precise, too intentional. By dawn, the sounds faded, leaving only an eerie quiet that pressed in heavier than any night's silence I'd ever experienced. Later, there was a different incident in the same camp. This time, the team was inside the log structure for the night. It was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with walls sturdy enough to hold in warmth, but not meant to withstand anything violent. Around 2 in the morning, they were awakened by the unmistakable sounds of something moving through the campsite. Logs snapping, equipment being overturned, and what could only have been immense strength tearing at the structure's perimeter. Their first thought was a bear or a moose, something enormous that had stumbled into the camp. They stayed perfectly still, refusing to go outside until daylight. When the sun rose, they discovered something completely impossible. The camp was untouched. The logs were in their original positions. The gear remained where it had been set, and the footprints that had seemed so clear in the morning light had vanished. The disturbance had occurred, but there was no evidence of what could have caused it. Even seasoned rangers who had encountered bears and mountain lions were left speechless. The final event I learned about happened in broad daylight. The team was taking a lunch break when one of them noticed a horizontal beam of white light floating across the camp. It wasn't like sunlight filtering through trees or a reflection from metal gear. It was perfectly even, almost like a fluorescent tube hovering silently above the ground. It moved slowly, stopping in the center of the campsite for a few seconds before disappearing completely, as if it had never been there. Everyone who saw it was shaken, but none could explain it. There were no wires, no reflective surfaces, no machinery anywhere near that could account for it. The light simply appeared and then vanished. After several years and repeated incidents like these, the decision was made to decommission the camp entirely. The location was removed from maps and hidden from all casual records. Rangers were instructed not to return unless absolutely necessary, and the area was essentially abandoned. Over time, the stories about the site became a mixture of rumor and cautionary tale, a place no one wanted to explore unless they had no other choice. Even hearing about these events secondhand, the feeling they leave is undeniable. That area has a raw, untouched quality, and something about the geography, the cliffs, the gorge, the way the light moves through the trees, makes it almost impossible to reconcile with normal experiences in the forest. Every time I think about it, I feel that same tension I imagine the rangers felt. The sense that you are being observed by something incomprehensible, and that the natural world can still hold mysteries beyond our understanding. ones that no amount of training or experience can prepare you for. I've walked many trails and camped in more isolated spots than most people ever will, but that location stands apart. It's not about ghosts or fairy tales. It's about raw phenomena that defy explanation. Sounds that no creature could make, physical evidence that disappears overnight, and light that moves on its own. The forest is supposed to be predictable in some ways. Even wild places have rules. But this place broke every rule I thought I knew. And that's why, years later, I still think about it with a chill, knowing there are corners of this world where nature, or something else entirely, refuses to be understood, and the safest choice is simply to leave it alone. It's a rare thing for a ranger to come away from a place feeling humbled, truly humbled, but that camp did it. It reminded us that no matter how much training, experience, or knowledge we have, there are parts of the wilderness where control is an illusion. The forest, in its quiet, unyielding way, reminded us that sometimes the unknown is best respected from a distance. The camp no longer exists, but the stories do, and they're enough to make anyone think twice about venturing too far off the beaten path. I wasn't a park ranger or anything like that, but the area I live in has this huge forest, dense and quiet most of the time, stretching farther than most people ever go. Me and a couple of friends used to go there a lot. It was a place we felt comfortable in, like we knew every turn of the trail and every clearing. There was even an old abandoned mini putting course somewhere deep inside the forest. Rusted holes, overgrown grass, broken signs. It had a strange charm, and we liked exploring it during the daytime. Nights, though, were another story. Usually, we didn't go after dark, but one night, for some reason, we decided to. The evening was calm at first, the kind of warm, silent night where the air is thick and still. We were walking down the trail that led into the deeper part of the forest. My friend had his music on, headphones blasting, but the forest around us was too quiet to feel normal. Halfway along the trail, I started hearing something. At first, I couldn't make it out. Just faint, distant noises, like a mix between howls and screeches, high-pitched, raw, and painful to the ears. I asked my friend to stop his music for a second. The instant the silence hit, the sounds came clearer. They were definitely coming from the left side, the side of the trail where the hill dropped off and the forest thickened. The right side of the trail had no trees, only empty land stretching to nothing in particular. I tried to convince myself it was just dogs. There were sometimes packs that roamed close to the edge of the forest, feral or maybe someone's escaped pets. But then I remembered there were no houses at all in that direction for miles, nothing human to account for the noise. The forest itself was isolated, dense, and dark. That made the noises feel unnatural. Not like an animal, more like a warning. One of our friends, the one who always had this weird gut feeling about that forest, wasn't with us that night. He had refused to go there after dark countless times, claiming he could sense something off. He called it a gut feeling, but he was serious about it. I didn't really believe in that kind of instinct, but hearing those noises made me start thinking maybe he wasn't being paranoid. The hair on my arms prickled, my stomach twisted, and I realized we were standing at a kind of threshold. Ahead, the trail curved left, deeper into the forest. Behind us, the way we came out into the open. We didn't speak, just stood frozen for a few seconds listening. The sounds didn't stop. They grew sharper, closer, but at the same time seemed impossible to locate. There was something in the way the forest swallowed sound that made it impossible to tell how near or far the source was. My friend and I exchanged a look and, without a word, decided not to take the turn. We backed off slowly, keeping our eyes on the tree line, moving away from the hill and the thick forest that hid whatever it was. We went the other direction, toward a neighborhood that wasn't far from the trailhead. It was quiet there too, but at least it was human territory. Houses, streetlights, the faint hum of distant traffic. We thought once we were out of the forest's immediate shadow, the noises would fade. We stopped outside a school near the neighborhood, just leaning against the chain-link fence to catch our breath. That's when it started again. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that the adrenaline was making me hear things. But it wasn't imagination. The same high-pitched howls and screeches carried through the air, subtle but unmistakable. We were at least a kilometer away from the forest by then, and still, the sounds reached us. There was no mistaking it. The forest itself was sending something out, not just the echoes of a pack of animals, not like a normal nighttime sound. There was a weight to it, like the forest was alive and aware of us standing outside it. We stayed there for a long time, just listening. I tried to analyze it logically, to rationalize it. Coyotes, perhaps, though I'd never heard a coyote make noises like that. Owls maybe, but owls didn't sound like that either. Something about it was off in ways that didn't fit with any animal I knew. We could hear movement in the underbrush along the tree line too, branches snapping, the faint sound of something large moving. Nothing approached us directly, but the forest sounded like it was aware, like it was marking our presence and watching. Eventually, we decided to leave entirely. We walked the streets back toward the edge of town, sticking to lit areas, sticking close together. The forest sounds didn't follow us directly, but occasionally from certain angles, we could hear a faint echo of them, a reminder that whatever was out there, it hadn't stopped. By the time we got to a gas station near the highway, the noises had faded, leaving only the normal hum of the town at night. That was the point where it felt safe enough to relax, though my stomach was still tight. After that night, we never went near the forest after dark again. During the day, it was fine, even fun, but at night, it was a different world. I think what scared me most wasn't just the noises themselves, or even the isolation. It was the certainty that something was out there that shouldn't be, something big, something aware. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost. It was just a real forest, wild and untamed, full of animals, sounds, and things humans weren't meant to encounter at night. That night left a mark. Even years later, whenever I drive past that trail, I can feel that weight in the air, that subtle sense that the forest is watching. And I remember the howls, the screeches, and the deep, unshakable fear of being so small and exposed in the middle of something so vast and alive. I had been working with an environmental nonprofit that contracted with the Park Service, spending a solid month down in Manti-La-Celle National Forest on a fuels reduction project. The job itself was grueling. Long days, constant chainsawing, hauling chopped brush, and clearing debris down steep slopes. The trail we were working on was far back from any main road, accessible only by an ATV trail that started with an absurdly steep switchback. The kind of trail that makes you question your life choices on the way up and your sanity on the way down. I'd gotten used to it after a few weeks, though. I liked pushing myself, liked the solitude of moving through the forest at my own pace, even if it left me sore in muscles I didn't even know I had. The last day of the project was supposed to be simple. The Park Service crew had been schlepping gear out all day, chainsaws, debris, tarps, fire shelters, all piled on their ATVs. One of my project partners was a mountain of a man, a solid 6 feet 5 inches with hair that was a rusty, dark ginger, a mop that seemed impossible to manage. He had been helping me carry the heavier brush and debris, a godsend since my back hated me for the month of nonstop lifting. He was slow but steady, methodical, the kind of guy you trusted not to get flustered under pressure. I, however, decided to hike back alone. I know it was stupid in retrospect, especially on a trail like that, but I wanted to push myself. The sun was already dipping behind the ridges, leaving long, slanted shadows across the dirt trail. My pack felt heavier than it should, my legs tight from a month of hard labor, but the forest had that clean, cold smell that makes your lungs want to take it all in at once. The switchbacks were narrow, and the trail curved sharply through dense foliage, thick with underbrush and fallen pine needles. As I rounded a wide bend, the kind that forces you to slow because you can't see around it, I heard a rustling. Not the usual snap of a dry branch underfoot, not a squirrel or bird warning you of human presence. This was deliberate, slow, and heavy. My first thought was that it was my partner, the ginger giant, catching up. I craned my neck. Even at 6 feet 3 inches, I had to push myself to see through the tangle of leaves and branches. At first, all I could see was a mop of hair, that reddish dark hue I knew so well, peeking out between the leaves. Relief flooded me briefly. I wasn't alone. Then it moved. The hair shifted, revealing bulk, way more than my coworker could ever carry. It wasn't just a mop. It was a mass of fur, thick, uneven, covering something impossibly large. The shape alone was unsettling, broader than any human frame, more than 6 feet of vertical mass, hunched in a way that didn't look quite human. The slow step it took was deliberate, almost cautious, and it had a rhythm that didn't make sense. My stomach turned as my mind tried to reconcile what I was seeing. The thing was moving like a person, upright, and yet that much fur, that much bulk didn't belong to anyone I knew, anyone that could walk the trail this late in the day. Instinct took over. I ran. Not a controlled jog or steady hike, but full-on, ragged sprinting until my lungs burned and my legs shook. The switchback seemed to stretch on forever, the trail twisting beneath my feet, roots snagging my boots, loose dirt sliding under each step. My pack bounced harshly against my back, and I barely noticed. Every thought focused on putting distance between me and that thing. I didn't look back again, didn't pause to catch my breath until I crawled into the relative safety of one of the Park Service trailers at the base, sliding the door shut behind me. I stayed there until the rest of the crew showed up, all of them sweating, tired, happy that the work was done. I asked if anyone had seen anything strange, mentioned the rustling, the shape, but no one had. They'd stayed on the trail behind me, maybe half a mile back, and hadn't seen a thing. I replayed in my head for days. I told myself it had to be an elk. There were plenty in Manti-La-Sal, especially in late autumn. Large, heavy, shaggy winter coats. I told myself the angle, the shadows, my exhaustion, and the adrenaline had made the elk appear upright, exaggerated in size. That explanation made the most sense. It was rational, grounded. I even tried to convince myself it couldn't have been anything else. But still, the image lingered. Elk don't step like humans, not in slow, deliberate motion, not upright with that kind of cautious intent. My brain kept arguing with itself. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't stand still like that for long, not when you're a human on a trail, and the fur was wrong. Too long, too uniform in color to be a bear, and the shape just didn't match. Maybe it was just the light, a trick of shadow against foliage. Maybe exhaustion had me seeing things that weren't there. I clung to these explanations because the alternative, the thought of something large, upright, and aware enough to take a measured step toward the trail, was too much to face. I never went back to that trail alone. Even when I returned later with a buddy or the crew, I avoided the stretch near the bend. I still work in forests, still clear fuels, still hike trails, but that day left a mark. I learned the hard way that adrenaline and imagination can exaggerate shadows into monsters, but there's a fine line between imagination and instinct. That day, my instinct screamed at me to get out, and I obeyed. Whatever I saw, whatever stepped out of the foliage, stayed in the forest, and I stayed alive. And in the end, that's the only clarity I needed. It was a late spring night, the kind where the air is cool, but not cold, and the sky is clear enough that the moon casts sharp shadows across the land. I had just finished a long day of work in New York City, the kind of day where your body is exhausted, but your mind refuses to stop replaying the endless stream of emails, meetings, and city noise. By the time I got onto Route 78 heading west, I was looking forward to nothing more than getting home, kicking off my shoes, and collapsing into bed. Traffic had been relatively light, given the hour, until I saw the signs. Route 78 closed ahead. Some accident, maybe some construction. The detour was clearly marked, and my GPS promptly recalculated my route. No problem. The highway gave way to smaller, more rural roads. I remember noticing immediately that the traffic had disappeared entirely. Not just light traffic, but completely empty. No other cars in sight. No headlights in the rearview mirror. Nothing. It should have been unsettling, but the moon was bright, and I could see the road perfectly well. The landscape was typical of rural New Jersey. trees lining both sides of the road, thick enough in some areas that they blocked the moonlight entirely, and occasional open fields that reflected the silvery glow of the night. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural. No birds, no insects, not even the occasional rustle of a small animal. My headlights swept across the road ahead and the edges, and it was then I saw them. 2 points of yellow light on the right side of the road. They were not stationary. They moved slightly, reflecting in a way that suggested the creature was alive, breathing, aware of me. My foot eased off the gas. I expected a cat, maybe a raccoon, something familiar. I braced myself, expecting it to dart off into the underbrush the moment I got closer. What came into view was strange. The animal itself wasn't large, maybe shin-high on me, and at first I convinced myself it was a dog or some feral cat. Its fur was dark, blending with the shadows, and its movements were odd. Instead of running in a typical sprint, it bounded, hopping in an irregular rhythm that made my stomach tighten. My first thought was that it had some kind of injury, some neurological problem, making its movement awkward. Then came the wings. I didn't see them at first because they were folded against the creature's body and the moonlight didn't illuminate them well. But as it bounded along the side of the road, it leapt into the small clearing in my headlights, and suddenly I saw them stretch open. Massive, membranous wings, spanning easily 5 or 6 feet from tip to tip. The motion was not smooth, not the graceful glide of a bird, but a sudden, powerful lift, like the creature was using raw strength to leave the ground. I froze. My heart hammered. The animal, or whatever it was, flapped once, twice, and then lifted into the air, moving away from the road into the darkness of the woods. The glow of its eyes lingered for a moment, and then it was gone. For a moment, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I had just seen. My rational mind kicked in. I told myself it had to be an owl, probably a great horned owl, catching some prey near the road. The hopping motion made sense if it had landed awkwardly or was startled by my headlights. But the wingspan, even thinking about it now, 10 years later, makes my chest tighten. I have never been able to reconcile the size with anything I've ever seen in nature. I ended up calling my brother as soon as I got back onto a more populated road. I needed to tell someone, even though I knew he would laugh or just shake his head. I described the creature as best I could, noting the size, the way it moved, and the wings. He didn't say much, but the next morning he sent me a picture of the so-called Jersey Devil, a dark, winged creature in folklore. The resemblance was uncanny. I know what I saw wasn't supernatural, but seeing that image after the fact planted a seed of doubt that never fully left. Driving the rest of the way home, my mind kept replaying every detail. The empty roads, the sudden appearance of glowing eyes, the odd hopping gait, the wings spreading in the moonlight. I remembered the smell of wet earth along the roadside, the faint rustle of leaves as the wind brushed through the trees, the distant sound of a creek somewhere off the road. Everything seemed normal, perfectly natural, but the combination of elements, the quiet, the isolation, and the creature, felt wrong. I didn't see another car until I reached the outskirts of a small town. It was past midnight, and the streets were deserted, but at least the familiar sight of houses, streetlights, and distant traffic provided a grounding sense of reality. By the time I got home, I had to park in my driveway for a few minutes, just staring at the dark woods beyond the streetlights. Part of me wanted to tell myself it had all been a trick of the shadows, a hallucination born from exhaustion and the late hour, but another part knew exactly what I'd seen. I never drive that route late at night anymore. Even during the day, when the road is busy, I feel a twinge of unease remembering that night. I've researched wildlife in that area extensively, trying to rationalize it, and the closest explanation is a large owl catching prey. Still, nothing I've found explains the hopping or the wingspan fully. 10 years later, I can look back and smile a little at my younger self, terrified and in disbelief. But I also respect the encounter. Nature can surprise you, and the quiet, empty roads at night hold things we rarely see. That night, I learned to slow down, pay attention, and trust my instincts. The experience was unnerving, but it didn't break me. I made it home safe, alive, and with my mind intact. That's the important part. I can't explain everything I saw, but I can say this. Even in the calm, quiet rural roads of New Jersey, life has its unexpected moments, and they demand respect. And now, every time I drive through the area, even in daylight, I scan the trees, remembering the creature that hopped, stretched its wings, and vanished into the night. It's a reminder that even ordinary roads hold extraordinary moments, and that sometimes just surviving them is enough. I grew up camping in the same mountain range my whole life. By the time I was 10, it already felt like a second home. My parents had been going there for 30 years before I was born, and the routines were set long before I ever picked up a sleeping bag. Same park, same rough dirt road, same thick line of pines that closed in around the truck as we climbed higher. Even the air smelled the same every year, that mix of dry soil, cold stone, and pine sap that somehow told my mind I was somewhere safe. I never questioned any of it. I just moved through those summers like they were part of the natural order of my life. That one trip, the year I turned 10, started like all the others. We unloaded the gear, set up the tent, and did the usual walk down the old trail that cut along the side of the mountain. It wasn't a long trail, maybe an hour from end to end, but I had walked it so many times I could picture almost every bend with my eyes closed. Nothing on that first day felt strange or out of place. I was tired from the drive, ate dinner, and crawled in my sleeping bag once the fire died down. It should have been just another quiet night in a long line of them. But that was the first night I had the dream. It wasn't anything dramatic. I wasn't running, I wasn't scared, and nothing chased me or tried to talk to me. All I did was walk along that trail I already knew so well. The trees looked the same as real life. The ground had the same narrow lines from bike tires, and the small bend halfway through looked exactly as it always did. But in the dream, right off that bend, there was a dark opening in the ground. A cave entrance. Nothing blocked it. Nothing looked dangerous. It was just there like it had always been. I didn't go inside. I just stood in front of it until I woke up. When I opened my eyes that morning, I didn't think much about it. Kids dream random stuff all the time, and I assumed it came from all the hiking and camp talk from the day before. But the next night, I had the exact same dream. Same trail, same bend, same cave. I woke up at almost the same point in the dream too, just standing in front of the entrance, staring into the dark like I was waiting for something but didn't know what. The third night it happened again, and by that point, it felt less like a dream and more like my mind was replaying something I should know but couldn't quite understand. I tried bringing it up casually during the day, thinking maybe someone had mentioned a cave years ago and I'd overheard it, but no one in my family knew anything. Not even stories. Every time we had walked that trail, it had been the same thing. Forest on one side, slight drop on the other, nothing that stood out beyond some old fallen logs and mossy rocks. I felt like I was remembering something that had never happened. By the fourth night, the dream was starting to bother me. I didn't want to say I was scared, but it made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. It felt too real, too steady, like it was insisting on something. The opening of the cave wasn't changing or shifting like dreams usually do. It looked exactly the same every time, down to the way the dirt was worn around the lip of the entrance, like something had been going in and out of it for years. And the thing that bothered me most was that nothing else in the dream mattered. Every night, it was just me walking toward that bend. No sound, no wind, no animals, just quiet that pressed on my ears. Then the cave. Then waking up. After almost a week of this, I finally talked to one of the rangers about it. I wasn't looking for anything supernatural. I just needed to know if something out there could have planted the idea in my head. When they told me that there had been a cave off that same bend, 12 years before I was even born, I didn't know what to say. They told me it had been filled in and leveled because bears used it, and since the camp area was too close, they didn't want any issues. They had never put it on any maps, never talked about it to visitors, never put up signs. They didn't want people digging around or getting hurt trying to find it. As far as the park was concerned, the cave never existed. After that, the dream stopped completely. Not slowly, not fading over time, just gone. That same night, I slept like I always did on camping trips. No trail, no bend, no cave. Just the usual cold air, the usual sounds, and nothing else. I didn't forget about it, though. Even as a kid, something about the whole thing stuck in my mind in a way I couldn't shake. I wasn't someone who believed in signs or spirits or anything that lived between explanation and imagination. I still don't. But that experience never felt like a dream to me. It felt like the mountain itself was showing me something I wasn't supposed to know, or maybe reminding me of something that had been part of it long before I ever walked those trails. As I got older, I kept going back to that same park. Year after year, sometimes with family, sometimes alone. I always walked the same trail, and I always slowed down at that bend. Even now, I can still picture the cave in my mind as clearly as if I had stood in front of it in real life. The ground there looks normal, packed dirt, some grass, a few stones, but there's a feeling in that spot that I can't explain. Not fear, not danger, just a strange pull, like the place knows me and I know it. I've never tried to dig or look for any sign of what used to be there. I don't want to disturb it. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered again, and I respect that. But every time I stand there, I get the same quiet sense that the mountain once showed me something for a reason I'll probably never fully understand. Maybe it was just a leftover memory from before I was born. Maybe it was something deeper. I don't pretend to know. What I do know is that after all these years, that place feels like a connection I didn't choose, but was given. Something tied me to that mountain long before I ever understood it, and the older I get, the more I accept it. I'm not superstitious, but I believe the land can speak in its own way, and sometimes it chooses people without them asking for anything in return. And for reasons I still can't explain, I believe the mountain chose me, and that bond is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. I went up that mountain thinking it would be a simple overnight trip, nothing more than a break from the noise of regular life. My friend and I liked choosing places far from any marked campsite, usually spots so quiet that even the air felt heavier. That mountain had always felt a little different, though. The air seemed sharper, and the silence had a weight to it that pressed on you the higher you went. But we liked that. We liked the idea of being truly alone with nothing around us except the trees, the wind, and whatever lived in the dark. We set up camp near a flat patch on the ridge, a place one of us had found years before. There was a single old tree stump near the center of the clearing, and the ground sloped slowly downward toward a narrow dirt road you could barely see through the brush. Behind us was a long drop into a valley that swallowed sound. The whole area felt cut off, like the world below had nothing to do with us anymore. As night came in, the temperature dropped fast, the kind of cold that creeps into your clothes, even when you're right next to a fire. We built the fire bigger than we normally would because of that cold, feeding it with dead branches scattered around the clearing. We were messing with the fire, breaking sticks, watching sparks float up into the dark. When I heard something so faint, I thought at first it was just my imagination. It was buried deep in the sound of the wind, almost like the air itself was carrying a thin vibration. I stopped without thinking, and that tiny break in sound made my friend stop too. I listened harder. At first I wasn't sure what I was catching, but then I realized it was something like a voice. A woman's voice. It didn't sound close. It wasn't loud. It was far away, drifting through the trees, barely strong enough to reach our clearing. It had a soft rise and fall to it like a melody. Not anything familiar, but something that felt old. Too old. The kind of sound that comes from a time that doesn't match the world we live in now. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like any language I knew. It was just this strange, almost haunting pattern of notes. I felt every hair on my body stand up. There was nothing magical about it. It wasn't supernatural. It just didn't make sense because we were miles from anyone. No campsites, no houses, no hiking groups, nothing. You would have needed to walk through dense woods and uneven rock for hours to get anywhere near us. And the direction the sound came from was deeper into the mountain, not toward the trail. The melody faded in and out with the wind. It didn't stop suddenly or break. It just continued at the same slow pace, the same strange pattern. We didn't talk. We didn't move much. We just sat there listening for as long as it lasted. My chest felt tight, and I kept turning my head slightly to see if it was echoing off the trees. But it wasn't an echo. It was a single voice, steady and distant. When it finally faded away completely, we didn't know what to make of it. There was no explanation that fit the place we were in. Slowly, the normal sounds of the forest came back. Crickets, the fire popping, the wind shifting through branches. But the mood had changed. The clearing felt colder, and the silence between sounds felt heavier. I didn't sleep well that night. Every few minutes I would wake up, thinking I heard something again. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps far down the slope. Sometimes it sounded like a small animal running. Sometimes it sounded like nothing at all, but somehow still felt wrong. The air around us felt charged, like something had happened that we couldn't see. When morning came, the sunlight made everything look harmless, but that didn't do anything to calm the tightness in my stomach. We packed up fast and headed down the mountain. A few days later, I posted some pictures of our camp on Facebook. Nothing special, just the clearing, the fire pit, the view over the valley. A friend commented on the post, asking if I heard anything weird up there. That question hit me instantly. It felt too direct, too specific. I asked him why he was asking, and he told me a story that made my skin crawl. He said he and another friend had camped near that same spot a while back. They had a dog with them, one that had always been calm and steady. But that night, they heard a woman crying on the road below the clearing. The crying got closer, slow steps on the gravel, like someone walking with no energy left in their body. They went to check, thinking maybe someone was injured or lost. When they reached the edge of the brush and looked down at the road, the crying stopped instantly. Not faded, not move away, just stopped like someone hit a switch. The road was empty. No figures, no movement, no sound. They went back to camp confused, and when they reached their fire, they found their dog collapsed next to it, shaking violently, foam around its mouth, completely unresponsive to anything. They grabbed the dog and took off down a mountain. The farther they drove, the less the forest felt like it was closing in. At the bottom, the dog suddenly went limp for a moment, then woke up completely normal like nothing had happened. No shaking, no confusion, just acting like his usual self. That scared them more than the crying did. They didn't go back after that. As he finished telling me all of that, I felt my stomach sink because the place where they heard the crying was the same direction I heard the singing. The exact same stretch of road. The exact same part of the mountain. Nothing supernatural needed to be involved. It didn't matter whether it was a person, an animal, or something else. The fear came from the fact that whatever was out there wasn't acting normal. Later, he actually took me back up there to show me the exact spot it all happened. Standing there, I remembered how the singing drifted through the trees from that same direction. The slope, the road, the angle of the trees, it all lined up perfectly. The spot felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain, like there was something in the air that your body reacts to before your mind understands why. I started thinking about the cold, the strange pressure in the air, the way sound carried differently, and the way the dog had collapsed. I started realizing it could have been something environmental. A natural gas pocket leaking out from somewhere down the ridge. A low-frequency vibration from deep underground. Something physical that the body reacts to in strange ways. Something that makes people hear things that aren't there, or seem like they're not there. Something that affects animals faster than humans. The mountain didn't need ghosts. It had enough hidden dangers of its own. Standing there on that slope, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever was happening in that area didn't care who walked into it. It didn't warn you. It didn't show itself. It just waited for you to make the mistake of staying too long. That was the last time I camped on that mountain. I didn't need to push my luck. Some places don't want you there, and the mountain made that message very clear. I was a ranger in Glacier National Park in northern Montana for a few years, and most nights were quiet in a way that settles into your bones. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing and pay attention to things you normally ignore. That night, around 3 in the morning, the radio crackled with a call about a camper in distress somewhere near our post, but still far enough out that we would have to hike about 45 minutes through rough terrain to reach the location. At that hour, everything around the station felt slow, foggy, and colder than it should have been for early summer. The sky was moonless, and the dark outside looked like a wall. We geared up fast, even though both of us moved with that half-awake stiffness that comes with being dragged out of sleep. My partner was new, a couple weeks into the job, still getting used to what nights in grizzly territory felt like. I could see his nerves even before we stepped off the post. I tried to focus on my pack, my boots, the straps, each thing I clipped or tightened, just to stay in that calm ranger mindset. But I had this little tug in the back of my head even before we started walking, the kind that shows up when something is off, even if you can't explain what exactly it is. We started up the trail, our headlamps cutting thin tunnels of light through the dark. Out there at that hour, the beams feel tiny compared to everything around them. The rocky terrain forced us to move slow at first. Every footstep had to be placed right, where you'd twist an ankle or send stones rolling down into places you couldn't see. The air was cold and damp, the kind that settles on your neck and makes your shirt cling a bit. The forest around us felt unusually still. No wind through the trees, no rustle of leaves, no insects even. Just that absolute silence that only shows up in deep wilderness. About 30 minutes into the hike, the gut feeling that had been tugging at me earlier hit me so hard it felt like walking into a wall. It was nothing dramatic, no loud sound or sudden movement, just this instinct that something wasn't right. At first I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the call, the hour, the quiet, the darkness, the terrain. But instincts in places like that aren't random. Years in that environment teach you that your body reacts before your mind has time to understand why. The trail narrowed as we got deeper into the rocky stretch, and the darkness felt heavier, like it pressed against us from all sides. My breath seemed too loud, my heartbeat too noticeable. We were about 10 minutes away from the location when we heard it. A sound faint at first, but unmistakable once it reached us fully. A baby crying. It didn't make sense. The sound cut through the dark like a knife. At 3-something in the morning, out in the middle of grizzly territory, miles away from any actual campground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up instantly. My partner heard it too, because he picked up his pace without saying a word. The crying sounded distressed, sharp, desperate. It triggered that automatic human response to help, and we both moved faster, stepping hard over rocks, brushing aside branches, breathing heavier. Then something in my head clicked. Not a thought, more like a jolt. The crying hadn't changed. Not once. Same pitch, same length, same pattern, same volume, even though we were moving closer. It didn't waver the way real crying does. It didn't shake or gasp or slip. It was the exact same sound over and over again. I stopped walking. I didn't even realize I'd stopped until I noticed my partner taking a few steps ahead before turning back. I just stood there listening. The same short cry, then silence, then the same cry again, perfectly spaced, identical. That feeling in my gut turned into something colder. I knew the sounds of the wilderness better than I knew most people. I knew the difference between a wounded animal and a human sound. I knew the way voices bounce between trees. I knew how easy it was to mistake one thing for another in the dark. But this wasn't any natural sound. It wasn't human either. It was a recording. It had to be. And the idea of someone sitting deep in the dark woods at 3 in the morning in grizzly territory, playing a loop of a baby crying hit me in a way that made my skin go cold. I signaled my partner to stop, even though my hand was shaking a little from the rush of realization. When he froze and listened, his face changed in a way I'll never forget. All the color drained out of him as he processed the same thing I had. That sound wasn't real. It wasn't alive. It wasn't natural. It was intentional. Everything in me said turn around. Everything in me said someone was out there, watching, listening, maybe waiting. Someone who set up that sound for reasons I didn't want to think about. Someone who had planned for people to come walking toward it in the dark. I felt this heavy pressure in my chest, the kind you get when your body decides danger is close. Not maybe close. Close. I didn't care about the call anymore. Not after hearing that. Not after realizing how wrong the whole thing felt. No camper in distress. No emergency. Nothing but a trap in the dark. We turned around and headed back the way we came, not running, but but walking fast enough that every step felt like trying to stay ahead of something we couldn't see. I kept checking behind us, scanning with my headlamp, expecting eyes or movement or something. But there was nothing, just trees and rocks and the long stretch of darkness behind us. The crying kept going for a while as we moved away. Same loop, same distance. Then it stopped completely. Not faded, just stopped, cut off mid-cry, like someone pressed a button. That silence afterward was worse than the sound itself. It followed us the entire hike back, like it filled the whole forest. When we got to the post, the first thing we did was check the call log. No follow-up, no second call, no confirmation, no missing camper. No one reported anything before or after. It was just that single message at 3 in the morning from a number that didn't match any registered visitor in the area. The more we dug into the records, the more it felt like the call came from nowhere. I've heard plenty of strange things in the park, but that night sits in a different part of my mind. The part that wakes up sometimes before dawn when the room is still dark and quiet. And I remember how that cry sounded exactly the same every single time. How someone was out there in the dark, wanting us to move toward it. How we never found out who or why. People always ask if I think it was an animal or some kind of echo. I always tell them the same thing. It wasn't either. It was a recording, a loop, a lure. And the part that chills me the most, even now, is knowing that whoever set it up heard us walking toward it in the dark. And they were close enough to stop playing it the moment they knew we weren't coming anymore. I never heard a sound in the woods the same way after that night, and I doubt I ever will. I'm not a ranger myself, but I spent enough nights around my old neighbor to feel like I lived parts of his job through the way he told his stories. He was one of those quiet men who only spoke when something was worth saying, and when he talked about his years with the National Park Service, he always carried this tired, heavy look in his eyes. He never tried to dramatize anything. He just described what happened, plain and simple, and somehow that made it worse. The story that stuck with me the most was the one from the Appalachian Mountains. The one he said bothered him longer than he ever expected. Every time I think about it, I still picture him leaning back in his chair on his porch, staring off past the tree line like he could still see pieces of that night. He told me that the night started out calm, almost peaceful. A warm 75 degrees, the air clean, the sky completely clear with a full moon that was so bright it washed the ground in pale light. It was the kind of night where everything felt open and harmless, like the forest itself was resting. He said it was the sort of shift where you could walk without a flashlight for a good stretch and still see every rock on the ground. He was only 30 minutes into his rounds, following a routine path he had taken dozens of times before. Every sound around him felt normal. Crickets buzzing, leaves moving under small animals, branches swaying lightly. Nothing strange at all. Then something tapped his shoulder. Not hard, more like the way a drop of water might fall from a leaf after rain. He didn't stop right away because it wasn't unusual for animals to be up in the branches above. Possums, raccoons, birds, any one of them could be moving around and knock something loose. He only paused when he felt the texture of it. It wasn't thin like water. It dragged a little across his skin, thick and sticky. He wiped it off without thinking, and that was when everything in him shifted. Even in that soft moonlight, he could tell something was wrong with what was on his fingers. He lifted his light and turned it on just long enough to see the dark shine of blood covering the tips of his fingers. It caught the beam in this dull, heavy way that made his stomach drop. His first thought was that maybe some injured animal was above him, maybe lying on a branch and dripping. But he said there was no sound coming from the canopy, no shifting, no breathing, no sign of anything alive. He tilted the flashlight upward, slowly, because he already felt something in him tightening. He said the beam cut through the branches like a clean blade, moving higher and higher until it reached the upper part of the tree. When the light landed on the shape, he froze. There was a deer carcass high up in the tree, so high that he had to tilt his head almost straight back to see the whole thing. It wasn't just a dead deer. It was torn apart in a way he couldn't understand. The body looked twisted, the legs bent at wrong angles, the hide split open in long gashes. Parts of it looked like something had ripped it apart and then pushed it back together with no care for how a body was supposed to be shaped. The ribs were exposed, the head hanging at a strange angle, the entire thing trapped between two large branches maybe 100 feet off the ground. He said his first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion, raw confusion that made everything slow down around him. He kept thinking he must be seeing it wrong. Maybe the light was catching shadows in a weird way. Maybe it was caught lower than it looked. Maybe the branches weren't as high up as he thought. But then he shined the light over the trunk of the tree and saw how smooth it was. The first 20 feet had no branches at all. It was the kind of tree you couldn't climb without gear, and even then it would be awkward and difficult. He had seen cougars haul deer up before, but never this high, and this park didn't even have cougars, not for decades. He said he stood there longer than he should have, staring, trying to make sense of how something could drag a full-grown deer that far up without any sign of struggle on the ground below. He said the more he looked around, the more wrong everything felt. The forest was too quiet all of a sudden, like something had drained the sound out of the air. Even the insects seemed to stop. He didn't want to move closer, didn't want to touch the trunk or look for prints or climb anything. He felt this pressure settle in his chest, this instinct telling him he wasn't supposed to be standing there. He backed away, slowly, the same way someone might back away from the edge of a cliff. Every movement careful and controlled. For the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was near him, not following him, not stalking him, just existing somewhere too close. He didn't run, he didn't rush his patrol, but he said it was the only shift where he could feel every second passing like something was counting them with him. When he finally made it back to the ranger station, he didn't talk about it with anyone. He didn't want to explain it because he didn't even understand it. The next day, he went back with proper gear, another ranger, and a plan to actually investigate. In the daylight, the tree looked even taller, the trunk even smoother. The carcass was exactly where he remembered it being, wedged so high up that even with climbing equipment, it would take effort to reach. There were no claw marks, no drag marks, no disturbed soil, no signs of a large predator. Nothing that suggested how the deer had been lifted that high. The weight alone should have snapped branches or torn bark, but it was just tucked there like something placed it quietly and carefully. That bothered him more than the sight itself. He said nature usually leaves clues, prints, scratches, disturbed dirt, broken sticks. But that whole area looked untouched except for the one thing that absolutely shouldn't have been possible. It was like only the final result was left behind and everything else was wiped clean. He stopped trying to guess what did it after that. Not because he didn't care, but because he realized that some things in the woods don't leave explanations behind. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is accept what you saw without forcing it into a neat answer. He wasn't scared of the woods after that night, but he respected them more. He said he learned that the forest is full of things that don't need to make sense to us, and you don't always get to know the reasons behind what you witness. That night stayed with him for years, not because of anything supernatural or unbelievable, but because it reminded him that the woods are old, wild, and far beyond our understanding at times. Sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't a monster or a creature. It's the simple proof that something out there has the strength, the ability, and the silence to do something that feels impossible, and it doesn't care whether anyone ever figures out how. He told me he never walked under that part of the forest again without looking up first, just to be sure nothing was resting above him. And honestly, ever since hearing that story, I find myself doing the same, even miles away from those mountains, even on normal days when the sky is wide open and empty. It's a habit I can't break, because once you hear something like that, you understand that the quiet of the trees doesn't always mean you're alone. I was never supposed to be out there alone, but things never go the way they're planned when you're training in deep woods that seem to swallow sound and distance. It was late fall, the kind of season when the trees are bare enough to make the forest feel open, but the underbrush is still thick enough to hide the ground. We were running a long land and AV exercise, something we had done dozens of times, but this place felt different from the start. The woods were older, thicker, and the ground was full of old cuts in the dirt from logging that ended decades ago. They looked like trails but led nowhere, twisting around heavy trunks and deadfall, tricking your eyes every few minutes. My pace was steady at first. The air was cold and dry, and the ground was soft with old leaves that stuck to my boots. I could hear the rest of the unit moving in the distance every now and then, the faint sound of branches snapping under someone's weight, or gear shifting, but I never saw anyone. I kept checking my compass, checking the map, making sure I wasn't letting the woods push me in the wrong direction. But somewhere during the last leg, something fell off. The land wasn't matching what I saw on the map. The small creek that should have crossed the grid line wasn't there. The drop in elevation I expected didn't happen. The forest looked the same no matter where I turned, like I was walking in circles without noticing. I slowed down, trying to figure out what I missed. The silence felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was waiting for something. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing it fade into this dull gray, the kind of color that makes the woods dim even though there's still daylight. That's when I realized I couldn't hear anyone anymore. No voices, no movement, not even the constant crunch of training gear that usually echoes through the trees. I walked for maybe an hour after that, trying to find a landmark that would put me back on track. The ground changed a little, sloping downward in one direction like a shallow ditch. There were signs of old activity everywhere. Rusted metal pieces that looked like broken stakes. A cut tree stump with moss thick enough to hide its rings. Deep tire tracks from some old truck that probably hadn't been used in 20 years. All of it made the forest feel lived in and abandoned at the same time. The more I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't just lost. I felt separated, pulled away from everything familiar, as if the woods had taken a step between me and the rest of the world. Then I saw them. 3 guys standing shoulder-width apart in a small clearing just ahead of me. All of them wearing the same kind of faded green utilities that looked like older issue gear. Their posture was straight, like they'd been standing there for a while. Their faces were plain, nothing odd about them except the expression they wore. Not fear, not concern, just a kind of tired stillness, like they were drained from a long day, but still doing what they needed to do. I felt an immediate wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't seeing things. We were all in the same forest, doing the same exercise. They were probably just another group, maybe from a different starting point. The clearing was quiet around them. The trees didn't move. The wind didn't touch the branches above them. It looked like the woods were holding their breath. When they lifted their arms and pointed in a single direction, the movement was slow and steady, like they were sure of what they were doing. No hesitation, no confusion, just a clear motion, showing me where to go. The direction didn't line up with what I thought was correct, but something in the way they pointed felt certain, grounded, like they knew exactly where I needed to be. So I followed the direction they gave me. For the first few minutes I kept looking back, expecting to see them still standing there, but the trees closed behind me as I moved. I couldn't hear their footsteps or any sign they'd left the clearing. It was like I'd imagined them, but I knew I hadn't. I could still picture the exact way they stood, the way their boots looked half buried in dead leaves, the way their sleeves looked darker at the elbows like they'd been damp for hours. As I continued, the ground finally started matching what my map showed. I recognized the slope, the crooked tree that leaned over the trail like it was reaching for something. I reached the edge of camp just as guys were loading gear and tightening straps on their packs. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment, thinking I'd wasted too much time wandering around. But the sergeant made it clear I was the last one back. Everyone else had made it in long before me, and they had been waiting on me to leave. When I told my buddies what I saw, the story slowed the packing down. They didn't joke about it the way Marines usually do when someone gets turned around. They didn't roll their eyes or make fun of my sense of direction. They just listened, their faces changing slowly as the details came out. When I described the 3 guys, the way they looked, the way they stood together like they were attached to that clearing, one of the older Marines nodded like he'd been waiting for me to say it. He told me about an old unit that trained in that same area decades earlier. 3 Marines went missing during one of their exercises. No radio calls, no tracks, no gear left behind. They searched for days, combing through the woods, checking ravines, riverbanks, old cabins, everything. No sign of them was ever found. Over the years, other Marines who got lost in that area said they had similar experiences. They all described the same thing. Three guys standing together in the woods, pointing them in the direction they needed to go, no matter how deep in the forest they had wandered. It didn't make sense, but it didn't feel supernatural either. It felt like something rooted in the land, something tied to the place in a way that didn't need explanations. Maybe those missing Marines had gotten stuck in a part of the forest where the terrain twisted and folded in on itself. Maybe they had found a safe spot and tried to point others back the right way because they couldn't leave. Maybe the cold, quiet woods preserved them in a way that made them look like they'd been standing there for hours. What stuck with me most wasn't anything strange or unreal. It was the tired look on their faces, the kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing you won't make it out, but still trying to help someone else find their way. That look stayed with me long after we packed up and drove off. The forest faded in the distance through the window, but that quiet clearing stayed sharp in my mind. I learned something about those woods that day. I learned that the land can hold people in ways that don't make sense on a map. I learned that getting lost doesn't always mean you're alone, and that sometimes the people who guide you back aren't part of your unit anymore, even if they still look like they are. And the ending is simple. I made it back. I walked out of those woods and climbed onto the truck with the rest of the guys. But every time I think about that day, I know I didn't find the right way out on my own. I followed the direction of three Marines who never made it back themselves. And that's something I still carry with me, long after the trees closed behind me and the clearing disappeared for good. I grew up around that land in southeastern Missouri like it was another member of the family. My grandpa had owned it since the 60s, long before I was born, and most of my early memories come from riding dirt bikes around the trails he carved into the woods. But even with all those years of tearing around out there were parts of the property that stayed untouched and strange, and nothing stood out more than that old rusted school bus sitting halfway back into the trees. I'd seen it since I was a little kid, always from a distance, always while moving, never long enough to really study it. It sat crooked in a shallow drop in the ground, almost swallowed by brush, as if the forest had been trying for decades to pull it under. Grandpa used to tell us to leave it alone. Not in a dramatic way, just in the simple, practical tone he used for everything that mattered. He never told us a story about it, never acted like it had any special meaning, but he didn't want us messing with it. Back then I thought he just didn't want us getting cut on the metal or bitten by something inside it. Now that he's gone and the land is split between the four of us, me, my brother, my aunt, and my uncle, I find myself thinking more about why he never tried to get hauled out, or at least opened up. If anything, the place seems stranger now that he isn't here to ground everything with his presence. I'd always been told the bus was there before he bought the property. They said it had been there since at least the 50s, maybe earlier, back when the area was nothing but thick, untouched woods and steep, unfriendly hills. There weren't even gravel roads near it back then. Even now, the only reason you can get within sight of it is because we cut trails for motorcycles. When I was a kid, that bus always looked huge to me, like the back end of some dead animal lying in the brush. The windows had old curtains hanging in them, actual cloth curtains, and they moved faintly whenever the breeze cut through the trees. That tiny motion always made it look alive somehow, like someone inside had just stepped away and left everything exactly as it had been. I never got closer than maybe 30 feet when I was younger. Everyone said snakes like to coil inside the thing. Copperheads mostly. The outhouse next to it, only 20 feet away, looked even worse. It leaned to one side, the wood soft and gray, the door barely hanging on. I could never understand why that stuff was out there to begin with. You don't just drive a full-size school bus miles in a forest with no roads. Someone must have lived out there, far from everything, long before any of us were around. And they must have lived there long enough to bother hanging curtains and building a little outhouse beside it. That thought always sat strange with me. It meant someone chose that loneliness. This past fall, a few months after we had settled the land between us, I went out alone to do some marking for boundary lines. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes sound carry far. I could hear my boots crunching over the leaf litter, hear every small branch crack under me. When I got near the old motorcycle trails, I saw the bus through the trees again. I'd seen it hundreds of times, but that day I stopped walking. Something about standing there alone made the whole place feel heavier, like the air itself carried old weight that no one had bothered to disturb for decades. I figured for once in my life, I should actually walk up to it. I didn't tell anyone I planned to. I just started moving toward it slowly, brushing branches out of the way, stepping around rotting logs. The closer I got, the more I noticed small details I'd never seen from the trail. The metal sides were eaten away with rust, but the shape was intact. The tires were long gone, sunk into the ground so deep that the whole frame settled unevenly. The curtains were still there, though torn and stiff. It looked like nobody had touched them in 50 years. When I got right up on it, I saw that the bus's door was stuck half open, the bottom rusted into the dirt. I could smell damp wood and old metal. Before sticking my head inside, I tapped the doorway with a long branch to see if anything moved. A few leaves shifted on the floor. Nothing else. I stepped closer and leaned in. Inside, the seats had been removed or torn out long ago. The floor was littered with old cans, rotting fabric, and dirt that had washed in over decades. But what got me most was that someone had lined the interior walls with sheets of plywood, almost like they were trying to insulate it. There were nails hammered in at uneven angles, and some of the wood had been painted white at some point, though the paint was peeling away in long curled strips. Near the back of the bus was a small folding cot frame. No mattress left, just the metal skeleton of it. Next to the cot lay a pair of boots, so old the leather had rotted through. I stood there for a long time, just taking it all in. Every part of it showed signs of someone trying to make it livable. Someone stayed out there long enough to sleep, to set up curtains, to build an outhouse. I kept thinking about how quiet it must have been back then. No trail, no roads, no motor sounds. Just a bus in the middle of nowhere with someone lying on a cot listening to the woods breathe. I walked back outside and checked the outhouse too. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside it was worse than the bus. Just a broken seat, leaves covering the floor, the whole thing ready to collapse. But there was one detail in there that bothered me more than anything in the bus. On the inside wall, carved deep into the wood, were vertical tally marks. Hundreds of them. Thin lines scratched so close together that the wood was almost shaved down smooth in that one section. I counted a few rows until I realized how many there must have been in total. Whoever lived there had kept track of something day after day, week after week, with no sign it ever stopped. Walking back to my truck, I felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't shake. I didn't see anything dangerous. Nothing chased me. Nothing supernatural. Just the unmistakable evidence of someone living out there alone for a very long time, marking each day they survived, waiting for something that never came, and knowing that my grandpa chose never to disturb it, never to talk about it, never to explain it, left me with an unease deeper than any ghost story. Now that the land belongs to us, everyone expects we'll clear out old junk and maybe even expand the trails, but I know I won't touch that bus or the outhouse. I don't want to know more than I already do. I don't want to dig around and find something that explains the tally marks, or why the curtains were still hanging, or why the boots were left sitting neatly beside the cot. Some things don't need answers. Some things sit in the woods for a reason. And after standing inside that bus, smelling the old air and seeing the quiet life someone lived in the middle of nowhere, I'm certain of one thing. Whoever stayed there didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because they couldn't. I'm a soil conservationist for the USDA, and most of my job is simple work on paper until I step out into the land itself. That's when the real part begins. A lot of people picture cornfields and quiet drives between farms, but in my county there are huge stretches of CRP prairie restorations tucked deep into heavy woods. I end up in those areas more than anyone else on our staff because I don't mind walking far off the road. I've always liked the feeling of being alone in quiet places, miles from houses and traffic. It helps me think. For most of my career, that solitude was a comfort. But there was one day that changed how I feel about being by myself out there. And even now, years later, the memory comes back so sharp that I can still feel the air from that clearing on my skin. It was late summer, humid and warm, the kind of day where the woods hold the heat like a sealed room. I had parked my truck next to a narrow dirt road and followed a faint trail through thick trees to check on some CRP acreage that hadn't been inspected in years. The county map showed it as prairie grassland, but over time the forest in that region had crept back in, pushing against the edges until only patches of open ground remained. My plan was to walk the boundary, take some photos, jot a few notes, and head back out. I didn't expect anything strange. I never do. You go out enough times, and you think you've seen every odd thing people leave behind in the woods. Old fence lines, burned tractors, broken hunting blinds, random pieces of metal from who knows what. Nothing ever felt dangerous. The first half mile, or so, was normal. The trail was narrow and covered in dried leaves, but I could still make out old tractor ruts under them. Birds were quiet that morning. Not silent, just distant. The deeper I walked, the more the air changed. It felt heavier, like the humidity had doubled in minutes. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead, even though I wasn't moving fast. I kept going because I wanted to get my work done before the heat got worse. Then the trail widened a little, and the thick trees opened into a small clearing. At first glance, it looked like one of those forgotten homestead yards I sometimes find, but the more I focused, the more wrong it felt. At the far side of the clearing stood a rusty swing set with chains so dark they looked burnt. Next to it was a huge rainbow-painted merry-go-round with chipped colors and long metal handles sticking out like spokes. Nearby sat an old yellow school bus with no windows, half sunk into the ground, its front end slightly tilted, as if something had pushed it and then just left it there to rot. Grass around it grew patchy and uneven, as if the ground underneath was disturbed at some point. I stopped walking. It was such an odd scene to find in the middle of CRP land. I remember my brain immediately trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was an old rural school site that was never recorded. Maybe kids had camped out here decades ago, and someone dragged a bus in. Maybe it was a private property holding no one bothered to report. I tried to push away the feeling that crawled up my neck, because everything about the clearing made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. Places can feel wrong sometimes. You just know. But that uneasiness turned into something much sharper when I noticed the merry-go-round. It was spinning. Not slow either. It was spinning fast, fast enough that the paint colors blurred together as it turned. The air in the clearing was absolutely still. I felt it. No breeze, no wind pushing through the trees, nothing that should have moved anything heavier than a leaf. Yet that huge metal circle was whipping around like someone had just given it a strong push. I stared at it, waiting for someone to step out of the trees, waiting for a kid to run across the clearing laughing, waiting for something, anything that could explain it. Nothing happened. The swing chains didn't move at all. The tall grass barely shifted. Only that single piece of playground equipment spun like it had a life of its own. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I'm not superstitious. I never have been. My work is grounded in soil surveys, data, old maps, and land boundaries. Everything has an explanation if you look hard enough. But standing there, watching that merry-go-round spin in perfect silence with no one around, brought a kind of fear I wasn't used to. Not jumpy fear, not panic, just a cold awareness that I shouldn't be there. I took a few steps backward without turning my back to the clearing. The air felt thick, like the trees themselves were watching. My boots made almost no sound on the damp ground. I didn't want to breathe too loud. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe a gust of wind had hit just before I arrived, and I missed it. Maybe something fell on it earlier and set it spinning. Maybe animals had played on it. But none of those made sense when I looked at it. The speed was too steady, too strong, too recent. I kept backing up until I reached the trail again. I remember how the temperature seemed to change the moment I stepped under the trees. The heat felt different, lighter, as if whatever heaviness was in that clearing stayed behind. I walked quickly, but not fast enough to look afraid. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, even though I had no idea what I thought might be watching. Well, I got far enough away that I couldn't see the clearing anymore, I finally turned and walked out in long, steady strides. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Inside the cab, the normal world came back. The smell of dust, the hum of the engine, the sight of the open road. Everything felt grounding. But I still remember how damp my shirt was and how my hands shook when I wrote down my notes from the site. I didn't mention the playground in the official report. I just said the boundary needed updating. I didn't want anyone asking questions. I didn't want to go back. Later that week, I looked into our old maps. I checked every historic layer we had. Nothing showed a school there. No homestead. No recreation area. No record of a property owner dragging playground equipment deep into the woods for any reason. Our archaeologist checked, too. He couldn't find anything either. It was like the clearing didn't exist on paper, only in memory. I never returned to that section of CRP. When my boss asked why I didn't finish updating the site, I told him he could go look at it himself if he wanted. I didn't explain more than that. He didn't press. I don't know if he ever went. Every part of me hopes he didn't. I still work alone in the field. I still walk into places far from roads and houses. But anytime I come across a clearing now, especially when I don't expect, I stop and listen before stepping inside. I pay attention to the air, to the silences, to the feeling in my own chest. And if something feels even a little wrong, I turn around. I learned that day that not everything strange in the woods has to be supernatural to make the hair on your neck stand up. Sometimes it's the things that have no clear explanation at all that stay with you the longest. And for me, that spinning merry-go-round in the middle of an empty clearing is one memory I won't ever go back to test again. I was Samantha back then, though everyone called me Sam, and I had only been a junior park ranger for a few months. I never named the park anymore, not because I want attention, but because I want distance. I spent 6 years in that uniform, trying to talk myself out of the things I saw, and when I finally quit, it felt like I had been holding my breath the entire time. Even now, a few years later, the memories still follow me. They do not fade. They do not soften. They sit behind my eyes like cold stones. My first strange experience happened so early in my career that I should have known the job would break me eventually. I was still trying to prove myself, still try to show I could take anything that came down the radio. When the call came in about screams near one of the popular trails, I didn't think much of it. Anyone who spends enough time in the woods knows a mountain lion can sound like a woman screaming. I had heard recordings before. It's eerie, but it's normal. What threw me off was my chief deciding to join me. There was no reason for someone of his rank to tag along on something so minor. I remember thinking he wanted to see how I handled myself. I was eager to impress, eager to show I deserved the job, eager to show I wasn't just another rookie who folded under pressure. We walked out, joking around a little, and I was trying too hard to sound confident. He kept things light at first, then made one comment that didn't register until much later. He told me to take even the small calls seriously because you never know what you'll find. Back then, I thought it was the kind of advice people gave for the sake of it. I didn't know he meant it literally. I didn't know he meant it as a warning, not a lesson. When we reached the area where the caller had heard the screams, we moved north off the trail and deeper into the trees. The forest felt normal enough at first, maybe a little too still, but I didn't think anything of it. We heard the scream again, and it did sound like a mountain lion, but there was something wrong with it. The tone wasn't quite right. It was stretched, pulled thin, like something trying to copy a sound it didn't fully understand. 10 minutes in, everything changed. It was like someone flipped a switch. The entire forest went dead silent. I don't mean quiet. I mean it felt like sound itself stopped existing. No wind, no insects, no branches shifting. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. For a second, I really thought something had happened to me physically, like I had gone deaf, but the look on my chief's face told me he was hearing, or not hearing, the same thing. His expression didn't show surprise either. It showed recognition, which terrified me more than anything else. The silence didn't drift in or fade out. It hit all at once, and then the buzzing started. It was low at first, like something far away, but it grew fast. It wasn't just a noise. It was inside my body. I could feel it in my jaw, in my teeth, in the back of my eyes. My skull felt like it was vibrating. My vision shimmered around the edges. I had never felt anything like it and have it since. Then I saw the shape. A black figure stepped out from between the trees. It wasn't a shadow or something imagined. It was solid, tall, maybe 7 feet, built wrong for any animal I knew. It moved slow at first, then bent down onto its hands, if they were hands, and started crawling toward us. The scream that came out of it wasn't a mountain lion or a person. It was something in between, stretched too far, like it had been twisted inside out before being forced through a throat that wasn't made to produce sound. My body reacted before my mind did. I stepped back, ready to run for my life, but my chief grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, nearly knocking me off balance. I tried to pull away, but he wrapped an arm around me and started forcing me backward, step by step. Even then, he didn't look panicked. He looked focused, like he had trained for this exact moment. I didn't know whether to trust him or shove him off and bolt, but something in his grip told me that running was a terrible idea. The buzzing got stronger behind us. I could feel it crawling up my spine. Every step made me want to break into a sprint. Every breath felt wrong. It was like the air was vibrating too. I knew it was behind us. I didn't see it move, but my body knew. I could feel the buzzing at the base of my skull, like a live wire. The thing let out these soft wails, nothing loud, but they sounded like they were brushing against the back of my neck. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept walking because he kept walking, and I was too terrified to do anything else. It took maybe 10 minutes to get back to the trail, but it felt like an hour. Every second, I expected to feel claws on my back or teeth at my neck. I try not to imagine it, but that just made the fear worse. When we finally stepped back onto the dirt of the trail, the sound came back all at once. Birds, insects, wind, everything like someone had unmuted the world. The buzzing stopped. The pressure in my head lifted. My chief let go of me as if nothing had happened. He didn't comfort me. He didn't check if I was okay. He didn't acknowledge the thing. He just started walking back toward the main base like it was a normal afternoon. I was shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. I asked him what it was, or maybe demanded it. I don't remember my exact words through the panic, but I remember his reply. Not the tone, not the emotion, just the words burned into my memory. There are things in the woods older than us, things we don't understand and can't get rid of. If you can't handle that, pack your bags now. I stayed. I shouldn't have. That moment was my hint, my warning, my chance to walk away before things got worse. But I stayed because the job offered small moments of peace and beauty that made me feel grounded. I stayed because I thought I could handle it. I stayed because I didn't want to quit before proving I was strong enough. I was wrong. I should have walked away after that first encounter. It wasn't the worst thing I experienced, not by a long shot, but it opened a door I never managed to close again. The woods changed for me after that. Every silence felt different. Every strange sound set my nerves on edge. I started to understand why no one talked openly about the things we saw. Once you start admitting they're real, you can't pretend the forest is just a forest anymore. Maybe one day I'll talk about the rest of it. Maybe I won't. Some memories are harder to face than others. But people should know the truth. There are dangers out there that don't fit into neat stories or explanations. And the worst part is that sometimes you survive something without ever understanding what it was. That not knowing is its own kind of fear. I left the job because the things I saw stacked up until I couldn't keep them inside anymore. Leaving didn't fix it, but it stopped the pile from growing. Now, I just live with what's already there and hope talking about it helps someone else realize the woods aren't always as peaceful as they look. I became a park ranger in 2008 at the age of 26, assigned to the Northern District of Clearwater National Forest in Montana. The district was remote, with long stretches of dense pine and fir trees, narrow rivers that cut through steep valleys, and trails that were barely maintained. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive from my station, which itself was an old ranger cabin built in the 1960s. The cabin had no running water and relied on a small solar panel system to power lights and radios. It was isolated, quiet, and perfect for someone like me who liked being alone in the woods. I had been on the job for about 6 months when something happened that stuck with me more than any other experience in the forest. I was 19 days into a solo patrol of the district. I would check the trails, the backcountry campsites, rivers for illegal fishing, and occasionally respond to hikers who had gotten lost. I was used to long stretches of silence, interrupted only by the wind rustling through the trees, birds calling, or the occasional groan of a deer moving through brush. On this particular day, it was late October, and the air had that crisp edge that made every sound sharp and clear. The forest floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, and the river that ran through the lower valley had already begun to freeze at its edges. I started the day by checking a remote section of the trail known as Black Pine Ridge. It was a rough path, barely wide enough for one ATV, and had steep drop-offs on one side. I was following the trail in my patrol truck, noting areas where erosion had worsened the path. As I drove, I noticed something unusual near one of the riverbeds. A small campsite with a fire ring and a few scattered cans looked recent. I hadn't seen anyone in that area for months, so I stopped to inspect. The ground around the fire pit was cold, and there were footprints leading away toward the river. I recognized them as adult boots, probably a man size 11. The prints were deep in the frost, showing he had walked carefully, almost tiptoeing along the edge of the river. It immediately made me uneasy because that section of the river was dangerous. Steep banks, icy water, and slippery rocks. I followed the prints slowly, keeping a safe distance from the edge. After about 50 yards, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. One of the boots was lying on the edge of a shallow cliff, dangling just above the river. There was no body in sight, no sign of a struggle, but it was obvious someone had slipped or fallen. I radioed the main station to report the situation, giving them my coordinates, and started back to the truck to get proper safety gear. I returned with rope, a climbing harness, and a first aid kit. The terrain was treacherous, with loose gravel and ice-covered rocks. Carefully, I descended toward the spot where the boot had been left. As I got closer, I spotted a partially hidden figure lying against the riverbank. He was unconscious but alive. I secured a rope around a nearby tree, moved cautiously, and managed to get to him. He was cold and barely breathing. I checked his pulse. It was weak but steady, and pulled him to safer ground. I called for backup again, giving them the new location. While waiting, I used my thermal blanket to cover him and poured some water over a small fire. I managed to start to keep him warm. The cold was intense, and I knew hypothermia was a serious risk. It took nearly 20 minutes before another ranger arrived in a small ATV, carrying additional gear. Together, we managed to get the man out of the river canyon and back to my truck. He regained consciousness as we drove slowly to the ranger station. It turned out he was a hiker from Wyoming, trying to reach a trailhead on the other side of the river. He had underestimated the ice and loose rocks and had fallen while trying to cross. He had spent hours near the freezing water, surviving only because he had a thick jacket and stayed as still as he could. The hospital later reported that he had mild hypothermia and a few minor fractures, but he was going to recover fully. That incident stayed with me for a long time. It reminded me how unforgiving the forest could be and how easily a single mistake could turn deadly. It also reinforced why being a ranger required vigilance and patience. After that day, I checked my equipment more carefully, always left detailed patrol plans with the station, and double-checked every remote area I entered. By the end of that season, I had gained more respect for the environment I worked in. The forest could be breathtakingly beautiful, but it was also relentless, especially in winter. The man I rescued later sent a letter thanking me, and I kept it in my cabin. Whenever I felt tired or frustrated, I read it and remembered that my job wasn't just about enforcing rules or maintaining trails. It was about saving lives and protecting people who trusted the forest to be something safe, even when it wasn't. That experience shaped how I approached every patrol afterward. I became more observant, slower, and methodical. I learned to trust my instincts about places that felt unsafe and never to underestimate the weather or terrain. By the time I left that district years later, I had dozens of similar stories, mostly minor rescues, lost hikers, or preventing accidents. But that first real rescue was the one that taught me the most. The forest could be merciless, but preparation, caution, and patience could make the difference between life and death. I started as a seasonal park ranger in 2012, assigned to the Cedar Ridge National Forest in Northern Oregon. I was 24 at the time, just out of college with a degree in environmental science, and eager to prove myself. The park itself wasn't huge, but it had its quirks: dense old-growth forests, steep ravines, and miles of logging roads that twisted through the hills. I quickly learned that being a ranger wasn't just about guiding tourists or checking permits. It was about paying attention to the land, understanding how weather and wildlife interacted, and sometimes being ready for situations that could turn dangerous without warning. It was mid-September, and the mornings had that sharp, cold bite that meant winter wasn't far off. I had been patrolling the northern boundary that week, hiking and driving along the old service roads to inspect trail conditions. The forest had a kind of quiet intensity then, with fog hanging low in the valleys and the smell of damp pine needles heavy in the air. I usually worked alone on these patrols, which I didn't mind. It gave me time to notice small changes in the environment: the subtle scuff of deer tracks in the mud, the tiny erosion forming along the trail edges, or the faint smell of smoke that drifted down from the ridges to the south. That day, I had decided to hike the Old Granite Loop, a trail I knew well, but hadn't walked in a few months. The trail was technically easy, but it had sections that became treacherous in wet weather. I started early, around 6:30 a.m., the sun barely touching the tops of the Douglas firs. My pack was light: first aid kit, extra water, trail map, and my binoculars. I followed the old switchbacks, paying attention to any signs of recent human activity. Cedar Ridge was popular for day hikers, but it wasn't unusual to go a day without seeing anyone, especially in the upper reaches of the loop. About halfway through the loop, I noticed that a section of the trail had been recently washed out. Rain from the night before had loosened soil along a steep incline, and part of the path had slid down into the creek below. This wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make the trail dangerous. I marked the spot on my GPS and made a note to flag it for trail maintenance. As I climbed higher, I started to hear an unusual sound, something like dragging, rhythmic, and deliberate. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch moving in the wind, but the sound was consistent, like someone or something was moving just out of sight along the ridge. My gut tensed. I was trained to notice irregularities like this. I slowed down, scanning the trees with my binoculars. After several minutes, I saw it: a mountain goat, large and solid, struggling to climb the steep slope alongside the trail. Its hooves were slipping on loose rocks, and it seemed to be exhausted. I froze, not wanting to spook it further, and observed. I had dealt with wildlife before, but seeing an adult goat in that condition, so close to a trail, was unusual. Normally, they stayed higher in the cliffs. My first thought was to check whether it could make it back to safer ground. I carefully approached, moving along a narrow section of trail. The goat seemed to notice me, but didn't panic. It just shifted slightly, watching. Its coat was matted and dirty, with small streaks of dried blood near one of its front legs. It was clearly injured, probably had a fall during the night. I knew I couldn't leave it there, because hikers coming along the trail would likely cause it to fall further or get hurt. I also knew I couldn't carry it myself. It was far too heavy. I decided to radio the backcountry rescue team. While I waited for them to arrive, I stayed in a safe position on the trail, keeping an eye on the goat. I had brought my field camera, so I documented the situation carefully: the angle of the slope, the size and location of loose rocks, and the goat's injuries. I also kept my pack handy with basic first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and rope in case I had to help secure it temporarily. The wind had picked up, and clouds rolled over the peaks, dimming the sun and adding to the tension. Time felt longer than it actually was. Every snap of a branch, every flutter of a bird, made me jump slightly. I reminded myself to stay calm. Eventually, after what felt like over an hour, the rescue team arrived. They were skilled in high-angle animal rescues, carrying harnesses and rope systems. We carefully rigged a pulley system from a large Douglas fir, securing the goat gently, and managed to lower it down to a flat section where it could be safely examined. The veterinarian who came with the team confirmed that the goat had likely sprained its leg badly, but it wasn't broken. It would need a week or two of recovery before it could survive on its own. The team left it in a temporary pen, and I monitored it for the rest of the day, ensuring that no predators approached and that it had water. By late afternoon, the goat was calm, resting in the shade of a fir tree. I finally allowed myself to relax. It wasn't a dramatic, heroic rescue, but it was real work, the kind that made a difference in a tangible way. I documented everything in my daily ranger report, noting the washed-out trail, the rescue procedure, and the goat's condition. When I finally hiked back to my station that evening, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky orange and pink. I felt a quiet satisfaction. Being a park ranger wasn't about adventure stories or danger. It was about noticing details, taking action when it mattered, and respecting the delicate balance of the forest. That day, a struggling animal made me rely on all the skills I had learned, and by evening, the forest had returned to its usual quiet, as if nothing had happened. I became a park ranger in the summer of 2012, when I was 26, stationed at a small district in the northern Rockies, not far from the border with Montana. The area was remote, dominated by dense pine forests, steep ridges, and rivers that cut deep canyons through the valley floor. The nearest town was nearly 2 hours away, a collection of cabins, a small gas station, and one diner. I had grown up camping and hiking in these parts, my parents taking me into the backcountry since I was a toddler, so I knew the wilderness better than some of the seasonal rangers who only came for a few months each year. But nothing in my life had prepared me for the kind of quiet, stretching tension that comes from being alone in a park district that large, especially when you are responsible for it. The first few weeks were a blur of paperwork, trail checks, and vehicle maintenance. The ranger station I was assigned to was a small wooden cabin perched on the edge of a ridge, overlooking the forested valley below. It had solar panels, a well, and a wood stove. I learned quickly that off the grid wasn't romantic. It was just a lot of waiting, repair work, and isolation. But I liked it. I liked the silence and the control of knowing these trails, these forests, these rivers as intimately as I did. One morning in early October, I was checking a trail leading to a series of small alpine lakes. The air was crisp. The leaves already faded into muted browns and yellows, and the first hints of snow were on the north-facing slopes. I drove my old, beaten-up Ford pickup down the dirt road to the trailhead, noting the tracks left by wildlife, deer, elk, and possibly a bear. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rattle of a branch or the distant murmur of water running over rocks. I was alone. No one else had reported to this trail in days, maybe weeks. I carry my usual pack: water, first aid, rope, maps, radio, and some food. My boots crunched against the fallen pine needles as I followed the trail. About 3 miles in, I reached a small creek. The bridge there was old, rotting, but still held enough weight to support me and my pack. As I crossed, I noticed something odd. The creek water was unusually low for this time of year. Normally the snowmelt kept it at a steady flow, but this section was more like puddles spread thin over the rocks. I made a mental note. Low water could affect wildlife, hikers, and even the risk of fire later in the season. I continued uphill, the trail narrowing as it wound between steep rock faces and dense trees. About a mile from the creek, I found the tracks of a hiker, recent, maybe from yesterday. It was unusual. Most visitors avoided this trail until late spring or summer. I looked around carefully, noting that there was no litter, no discarded gear, no broken branches to suggest someone had camped nearby. Just footprints in the dirt heading toward the ridge. I followed them cautiously. As I ascended, I noticed subtle signs: disturbed rocks, snapped twigs, and a faint trail of blood, just a few drops. My heart rate increased slightly, but I didn't panic. I knew the terrain. If someone was injured, they could be in serious trouble quickly. I radioed my station, letting them know where I was and what I had found, and requested that they alert the emergency rescue team. The trail led to a narrow saddle between two ridges. There, in a small clearing, I found him, a young man, maybe 20, sitting against a rock, holding his ankle. He had slipped on wet moss and twisted it badly. His pack was still on him, but he couldn't walk. I assessed him carefully. No life-threatening injuries, just a badly sprained ankle. I kept him calm, told him to stay put while I radioed for more detailed extraction instructions. I applied a temporary splint using my trekking poles and some straps from my pack, making sure he was stable. I stayed with him until the rescue team arrived, keeping him warm and hydrated. The helicopters took their time to arrive, slowed by the steep terrain and tree cover. But eventually, a team lowered a rope harness, lifted him safely, and brought him to the valley below. The entire ordeal had lasted over 5 hours, but by the time I walked back down the trail alone, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, the valley bathed in orange and purple light. I felt drained, but also strangely satisfied. Back at the cabin, I wrote my report, noting every detail of the trail, the creek, the footprints, and the injury. I ate a simple meal, checked my gear, and watched the stars come out. The forest was quiet again, just the wind and the distant calls of owls. I realized something as I sat there. Being a ranger wasn't about heroic saves or dramatic chases. It was about vigilance, patience, and careful observation. Every detail mattered, and every action could make the difference between life and death in the wilderness. By the next morning, the park had returned to its usual calm. The creek looked normal, the trail quiet. I patrolled a few more miles before returning to the cabin, feeling the weight of the isolation, but also a sense of accomplishment. I knew I had helped someone, ensured their safety, and kept the park as it should be. Wild, but navigable, dangerous, but manageable. That day reinforced why I became a ranger. Not for the title, not for recognition, but for the responsibility and the quiet fulfillment that comes with keeping the wilderness safe. I had been a park ranger for nearly 12 years, mostly at Cedar Creek National Park, a stretch of wilderness in northern Montana that few people ventured into. The park was known for its jagged ridges, dense pine forests, and stretches of rivers that ran almost undisturbed. I loved it here. I had grown up camping and hiking, so the solitude and rhythm of the seasons felt natural to me. This particular story takes place in the summer of 2015, when I was 31, a little over halfway through my career. It started as a routine patrol. I had left the main ranger station before dawn, just as the sun began to cast a soft glow over the treetops. My route that day was one I had done dozens of times, a loop that went from a northern trailhead near Stillwater Lake, up through the old logging roads and along the ridge trails that overlooked the river valley. The air was crisp, and the scent of wet pine and moss filled the cab of my truck as I drove. I had the radio on low, mostly static, just to hear some background noise in case I needed to report anything. About an hour into the patrol, I noticed a small plume of smoke rising in the distance. It was far off, just a flicker against the early light. My stomach sank a little. Smoke in the middle of a dry summer meant a fire, and even a small one could quickly get out of control in these forests. I grabbed my binoculars and carefully scanned the area. The smoke seemed to be coming from the valley, near an old ranger cabin that had been abandoned for years. It wasn't much, just a curl of gray, but it was enough for me to start moving toward it cautiously. I parked my truck on a side trail, grabbed my fire-resistant jacket, a small shovel, and my radio, and began hiking down toward the source. The trail was steep and overgrown, covered in layers of pine needles, and I had to navigate around fallen trees from last winter's storms. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, the smoke had grown slightly, and I could smell the faint tang of burning underbrush. My heart rate quickened, not out of panic, but out of that instinctive alertness you develop as a ranger. Fires spread faster than people realize, especially when there's a breeze. When I finally reached the edge of the small clearing, I saw it, a patch of dry grass, maybe 20 feet across, burning slowly. There were no flames yet, just a smoldering heat and thin lines of smoke. I quickly dug a small trench around the area, cutting the grass with my shovel and scraping down to the dirt. Then I used a combination of dirt and water from my canteen to put out the smoldering spots. It took nearly an hour of kneeling, scrubbing, and pouring water to be sure it was completely out. As I worked, I scanned the surrounding forest for any signs of the cause. There were no people, no campsite, nothing except a small pile of dry branches someone might have left behind. Most likely, lightning or an unnoticed ember from a passing hiker had caused it. Exhausted, I finally leaned back against a tree and took a moment to catch my breath. The sun had climbed higher, casting golden light through the pines. My arms were sore from digging, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I could feel my heart still racing from the rush of adrenaline. That's when I noticed something else. The ground around the cleared area looked strange. Not damaged, not burned, just uneven. I crouched down and realized the dirt had impressions, like tracks, leading away from the smoldering patch into the thicker forest. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, and they were fresh. I spent the next hour following them carefully, moving silently through the brush. They led me downhill along the riverbank until I finally came to a small clearing where someone had clearly set up a makeshift camp. There was a torn tent, a few empty cans, and a small pile of ashes. No one was there now, but judging by the warmth of the ashes and the faint scent of smoke, the person had left recently. I noted the location and condition of the campsite carefully in my notebook. I knew the park had rules against unauthorized camping, but I also knew that some people just wanted to get away from the world. Still, the fire had been careless, and that was dangerous. I spent another 30 minutes patrolling the surrounding area, making sure there were no lingering sparks before I finally headed back to my truck. The climb back up the trail was brutal. My legs ached from the uneven terrain and the exertion, but I felt a strange satisfaction. I had stopped a fire before it could spread, and I had documented a potential safety hazard. That's part of the job. You rarely get recognition, but there's a quiet pride in knowing you kept a forest and its visitors safe. When I returned to the ranger station, I filed my report. I marked the fire site, the abandoned camp, and the tracks leading into the forest. Later that afternoon, a team was sent out to investigate, and they confirmed my notes. The fire had started from human negligence, and the camper had left the area. No damage beyond the small patch, no harm to wildlife, and no injuries. It was a relief. I sat in the station, eating a cold sandwich, and looked out at the mountains. The forest had been tested that morning, but it had survived, and I had played my part in keeping it safe. As the sun set, painting the sky with oranges and purples, I walked back to my small cabin at the edge of the park. I felt tired in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion. Every muscle sore, every nerve buzzing, but also grounded. The forest was alive, unpredictable, and demanding, but I knew it a little better now than I had that morning. And that knowledge, the quiet responsibility of watching over it, was more than enough. That night, I went to sleep with the windows open, listening to the sound of the river and the wind in the trees. The park was safe for now, and I had done what I could to keep it that way. No drama, no heroes, no miracles, just a day in the life of someone who cared enough to notice, to act, and to protect. I had been a park ranger for just over 6 years by the summer of 2017. My name is Mark Lawson, and I was stationed at Blackwood National Forest, a sprawling area of rugged hills, deep valleys, and dense pine groves in northern Idaho. I wasn't new to wilderness work. My father had been a ranger in Montana, and I grew up camping and hiking. But Blackwood had a reputation for being remote and unforgiving. That summer, I was 32, and I had just taken on the role of the district's lead backcountry ranger, which meant most of my days were spent patrolling trails, checking on hikers, and responding to reports of missing people or injured campers. One morning in late July, I started my day before sunrise. The forest was cool, the air crisp with the smell of pine and damp earth. I had a route plan that took me along one of the less traveled trails, a narrow dirt path that wound along the edge of a canyon. The trail wasn't difficult, but it required constant attention. Loose rocks, fallen branches, and overgrown underbrush could trip anyone who wasn't careful. I loaded my pack with the essentials: water, a first aid kit, trail maps, a radio, and a small toolkit for minor repairs on trail markers and signage. As I walked, the forest slowly lit up under the morning sun. The birds were active, singing and calling out to each other. I passed a small creek that cut through the middle of the trail and noticed that the water was unusually low, which made me slightly uneasy. The previous week had seen little rainfall, and I knew from experience that dry creeks could lead to fire hazards later in the day. I made a mental note to report the low water levels to the station. Around mid-morning, I reached a section of the trail that had recently been partially washed out by a flash flood during a sudden storm the previous spring. The damage wasn't extreme, but the soil was loose and tree roots were exposed. I had patched parts of the trail before, but this area needed more work. I put on my gloves and started digging small channels to divert water and stabilize the path with rocks. It was slow, sweaty work, and by noon, the sun was high and oppressive. I stopped for a lunch break on a large boulder overlooking the canyon. The view was stunning. The forest stretched endlessly, with ridges and valleys fading into a faint blue haze in the distance. I ate a sandwich, drank water, and took a moment to just sit and breathe. After lunch, I resumed my trail maintenance, moving carefully along the fragile sections. That's when I noticed something unusual: a set of fresh footprints in the soft soil next to the creek. The prints were large, definitely human, and seemed recent. I crouched down to examine them. They were bare feet, and the pattern suggested someone had been running. My gut tightened. Late summer was busy with hikers, but it was rare to see barefoot travelers out here, and the speed implied they hadn't been hiking leisurely. I took out my radio and called the ranger station to report the footprints. They acknowledged and asked me to keep an eye out in case I spotted anything else. I continued along the trail, following the footprints as best as I could, though they disappeared after a few hundred meters near a dense thicket. The underbrush was thick and tangled, making it hard to see very far ahead. I slowed my pace, scanning carefully, when I suddenly heard a faint rustle, a snapping of branches, like someone moving quickly but cautiously. My heart rate picked up. I had been alone for hours, and while I wasn't afraid of the forest itself, I knew that people could get hurt easily in these areas, especially if they were unprepared. I moved toward the sound cautiously, keeping low and silent. About 50 feet into the brush, I saw him, a teenage boy around 16, barefoot, wearing torn shorts and a soaked t-shirt. He looked exhausted, dehydrated, and scared. His eyes widened when he saw me, and he froze in place. I didn't speak. I kept my hands visible but reached for my water bottle. He was clearly in need of help. Slowly, I motioned for him to come toward me. He hesitated, but then walked carefully in my direction. Once I reached him, I could see the full extent of his condition. He had scratches along his arms from branches, his feet were cut and bloody, and he was dehydrated to the point of dizziness. I gave him water first, then carefully guided him back to the trail. He told me later, at the ranger station, that he had gotten separated from a small group of hikers earlier that morning. They had assumed he had turned back, and he had spent hours trying to find the trail again, panicking and running through the forest barefoot. I radioed the station again, and they arranged for a pickup team to meet us at the trailhead. It took another hour to slowly walk him out, helping him over rocks and fallen logs. The sun had shifted lower, and the forest looked entirely different in the late afternoon light. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the air was warmer, but still carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. By the time we reached the trailhead, a small team was waiting with a first aid kit and a vehicle to drive him to the ranger station for further care. I stayed with him until he was stable, then filled out the necessary reports and returned to my patrol duties. Walking back along the canyon rim, I reflected on the day. It was exhausting, physically and mentally, but seeing him safe and alive gave me a deep sense of satisfaction. The forest was beautiful, but could be unforgiving, and it reminded me of why our work as rangers mattered. People trusted us to keep them safe in places where danger could appear suddenly, where the landscape itself demanded respect. That evening, as I sat in the ranger cabin, cleaning my gear and jotting notes in the logbook, I felt a quiet satisfaction. It had been a long, hot day, filled with hard work and a moment of genuine urgency. The forest was still outside, dark and quiet, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Everything was in order, and the boy was safe. That night, I went to sleep feeling accomplished and content, knowing that my vigilance had made a difference. I had been working as a park ranger in the northern section of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana for almost 6 years by the time this incident happened, back in the summer of 2012. I was 28 at the time, relatively young for a ranger, but I had been raised camping and hiking in the Rockies with my family, so the forest felt like home to me. The Bitterroot is a vast place, dense with pine and larch, crisscrossed with steep ridges, rushing streams, and endless trails that climb into the high country. Most of the time, life as a ranger was a quiet rhythm of patrols, maintenance, fire watch, and sometimes dealing with campers who weren't exactly following the rules. But occasionally, the forest would remind you how unpredictable and unforgiving it could be. It was early July, one of those dry, warm summers where the days stretch long and the evenings smell like sun-warmed needles and grass. I had just finished my morning patrol along the upper stretches of the East Fork Trail, checking for fallen trees, loose rocks, and signs of campers setting up in unauthorized areas. Around noon, I parked my ranger truck near a small pullout above the creek. The area was steep, but the view of the valley below was worth it. I had a few hours before I had to report to the main station, so I decided to hike a short segment of the old fire road that had been closed off for years. It wasn't a popular trail anymore, overgrown in places, but it was quiet, and I wanted to stretch my legs. The hike started normally, with the usual chorus of birds and the distant rush of water from the creek. I kept my radio in my pack and my map in my pocket, just in case. The further I climbed, the narrower the path became, the soil loose and crumbly underfoot. About an hour in, I reached a section where the forest opened to a small ridge. From there, I could see the full sweep of the valley below, the creek snaking through the trees like a silver ribbon. The sight made me pause. I always liked these moments when the forest felt completely mine, when the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the call of a hawk circling overhead. That's when I noticed the trail had suddenly changed. Not in a supernatural way, but physically, it was as if erosion and neglect had taken a stronger hold here. A section of the trail had collapsed into a narrow gully, leaving a steep drop-off on one side and a wall of dirt on the other. There were no warning signs. Nature had just claimed this segment. I took out my radio and tried to call the station, but I only got static. Not unusual for this area. Coverage was always spotty. I carefully tested the path with my boots, looking for stable footing. I could have turned back, but curiosity and maybe stubbornness kept me moving. That was when I noticed something odd on the ridge below me. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log or a boulder, but as I looked closer, I realized it was a person. Not moving much, lying face down near the edge of the creek. My heart jumped, and I immediately started down the slope. Reaching the base, I found an older man, maybe in his 60s, conscious but clearly exhausted. His clothing was torn, and he had several scratches on his arms. He said he had been hiking alone, lost track of the trail, and slipped trying to get water from the creek. Judging by his condition, he had been there for hours in the hot sun, and dehydration was starting to set in. I gave him some water from my pack, helped him sit, and assessed his injuries. Nothing seemed broken, but he was weak and sunburned. I radioed the station again and explained the situation. They told me a ranger team would be there in about 45 minutes to help with extraction. In the meantime, I stayed with him, shaded him under a small pine, and tried to keep him calm. We didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. I could see the relief on his face just from having someone there who knew the forest and could get him out safely. The wait felt long, even though it was only 40 minutes. I kept my eyes on the ridge above and the surrounding forest, noting every shadow, every movement. It's something you learn as a ranger. Situational awareness becomes second nature. Eventually, I heard the distant rumble of a truck and the approach of another ranger team. They moved efficiently, securing the man and carrying him up to the trailhead where an ambulance was waiting. I stayed behind for a while, making sure the trail markers were clear and noting the hazard for future patrols. After the team left, I walked back along the fire road, tired but satisfied. I thought about how fragile our safety is out here. The forest doesn't care about schedules or rules. It just exists, beautiful and dangerous. That day reminded me of the responsibility we carry as rangers, not just to protect the land, but to protect the people who come into it. By the time I returned to my truck, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. I drove back to the station, the creek and the lost man now behind me, a quiet sense of closure settling in. Weeks later, I learned he had made a full recovery and had even written a letter to the Park Service thanking the team that rescued him. It wasn't a dramatic story of heroics, just a careful, patient day of paying attention and taking responsibility. But it stayed with me, a reminder that even in the routine life of a ranger, the forest could demand your full focus, and every decision mattered. I returned to that trail many times in the following years, always repairing small signs, clearing loose rocks, and making sure the route was safer. The ridge where he had fallen was marked with a new sign, warning hikers of the unstable section. And every time I walked past it, I remembered the summer day when the forest reminded me, quietly but firmly, why we are here, not just to admire it, but to look out for each other within it. I had been a park ranger in the northern reaches of Montana for just over 5 years, stationed at a small, relatively isolated district that covered rugged forest land, steep ridges, and a handful of remote trails that hardly saw any visitors outside of summer. In the summer of 2019, I was 28 years old, still fairly new to the solitude and unpredictability of this park. My station was a modest cabin tucked near the edge of a large pine grove, where the sunlight only reached in patches and mornings began with fog so thick it felt like walking through water. I had grown up camping in the Rockies, so the environment wasn't unfamiliar, but living there alone was different. Every sound, every snap of a branch felt amplified, and every shadow seemed to hide possibilities. It was a late July morning when I received my first indication that something unusual was happening. The air had that dry, pine-scented quality typical of early summer, and the sun had just started spilling over the ridges when I began my routine patrol along the East Ridge Trail. The trail was rarely used, mostly because it was long and rough, and I often felt like I had the entire stretch of forest to myself. On this particular morning, however, I noticed a series of fresh tire tracks cutting across a narrow dirt path that wasn't meant for vehicles. They were deep, heavy, and inconsistent with the kind of tracks left by park maintenance or my own patrol vehicle. My chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with that ranger instinct to notice anything out of place. I spent the next couple of hours following the trail of tire marks, weaving through dense pines, overgrown brush, and jagged rock formations. The forest was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant calls of ravens circling overhead. As I followed the tracks, I noticed other signs: discarded water bottles, flattened underbrush, and faint footprints alongside the tire marks. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They had been exploring, possibly looking for something deeper in the forest. My experience told me that people who went off-trail in these conditions were often unprepared for the terrain. I knew the ridge well enough to recognize that straying from the marked path could easily turn dangerous. Around noon, the trail led me to a small clearing I knew well from previous hikes. There was a shallow stream running through it, and the sunlight glinted off the water in patches, illuminating a mess that looked out of place. A tarp had been draped over a pile of branches, some cans, and remnants of a fire. The scene told me someone had camped here recently, and, judging by the freshness of the footprints, it hadn't been long. I examined the area carefully. The fire pit had been extinguished poorly, and there were faint markings in the dirt that suggested someone had been trying to conceal something. I didn't panic, but I noted everything meticulously. This was my job, and every detail could matter later. By mid-afternoon, I decided to backtrack and investigate the ridge above the clearing. The climb was steep, and the rocks were loose, but the vantage point at the top gave me a clearer view of the surrounding forest. That's when I noticed the vehicle responsible for the tracks, partially hidden behind a stand of pines. It was a small off-road truck, its paint scratched and covered in dust, as if it had been driven recklessly for miles. No one was in sight. My mind raced, considering all the possibilities. Hikers lost in the forest, poachers, or someone intentionally avoiding detection. I marked the location on my GPS and took photographs, knowing that reporting this accurately would be important if law enforcement or park management needed to investigate. I didn't approach the truck at first. I knew the risks of encountering an unknown person who might panic or act unpredictably. Instead, I spent the next couple of hours carefully circling the area, noting additional signs of human activity, like more discarded packaging and footprints leading further into the forest. By evening, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped quickly, the forest taking on that blue, shadowed quality that always made me more alert. I decided to return to the cabin before dark. Once I was back, I filed a detailed report and shared it with my supervisor. The next morning, park law enforcement came out to inspect the truck and the surrounding area. It turned out that the vehicle belonged to a group of amateur geocachers who had ventured off trail to retrieve a hidden cache. They had gotten stuck and, in their haste to move through the dense forest, had left a mess that could have easily been mistaken for something more sinister. They were fined for their disregard of park rules and the potential hazards they created, but fortunately, no one was hurt and nothing illegal was involved. The incident stuck with me not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me of the thin line between adventure and risk in wilderness areas. I spent the next few weeks checking that section of the forest regularly, clearing debris left by hikers, repairing minor trail damage, and ensuring that anyone who went off trail had clear warnings posted. By late August, the ridge was quiet again, the forest returning to its natural rhythm. Birds nested undisturbed, deer crossed the clearing at dawn, and the stream ran clean and clear. It was a relief, a return to normalcy that reminded me why I love this job. The forest could be unpredictable, but with careful observation and respect for its power, it remained a place of beauty and balance. By the end of that summer, I had learned more about patience, vigilance, and the importance of clear documentation. It wasn't a story of danger narrowly avoided or heroic rescue. It was a story of awareness, responsibility, and the small victories that come from keeping both visitors and the wilderness safe. That experience shaped how I approached every patrol afterward, and I carried that lesson with me through every foggy morning, every sunlit ridge, and every quiet, untouched clearing I had the privilege of watching over. I became a park ranger at the tail end of summer in 2007 when I was 24. It was my first full season, and I was assigned to a district in northern Montana near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The park was massive, with rolling forests, steep ridges, and stretches of rivers that seemed to go on forever. The area was largely wild, with very few roads and even fewer people. My base was a small, weathered ranger station built in the 1960s, mostly made of wood that had grayed and warped over time. Solar panels on the roof provided a little electricity, but the system was old and finicky. We had a generator for backup, though it was loud and cranky. The first few weeks were mostly routine. I patrolled trails, checked camping permits, cleared fallen trees from small forest roads, and occasionally guided lost hikers back to safety. My days started early, usually around 6, when the sun barely touched the tops of the pine trees, and ended late, with only the soft hiss of my campfire or the hum of the generator for company. At night, the forest was alive with the rustling of small animals and the distant calls of owls. It was beautiful, but it could feel lonely. One week in late September, I was scheduled to do a solo backcountry patrol in a part of the park that wasn't heavily trafficked. The trail I planned to follow ran along the east side of a ridge, winding through dense spruce and fir. The maps I carried marked a few old logging roads, abandoned cabins, and several small creeks. I had my backpack with standard gear: first aid kit, maps, compass, flashlight, extra food and water, and a two-way radio. Cell service was non-existent, so I relied on the radio to check in every few hours. The morning I set out, the air was crisp, almost cold for the season. A layer of frost clung to the underbrush. I hiked steadily, keeping an eye out for wildlife and anything unusual: broken branches, tire tracks, or signs of fire. Around midday, I reached a small clearing that overlooked a narrow valley. Sunlight poured down the slope, highlighting a stream that curved through the trees below. I stopped for a short break, eating a granola bar and drinking some water while scanning the area with binoculars. Everything looked normal. I continued along the trail, but after a couple of hours, I noticed something odd. The trail markers I relied on were fewer and further apart, and the path itself seemed less traveled. I pulled out my compass and map and realized I had drifted slightly off the mapped route. I adjusted my course and pressed on, trying to stay calm and alert. That's when I spotted it: fresh tire tracks cutting across the forest floor. They weren't deep enough for a large vehicle, maybe an ATV or a small dirt bike. The tracks weren't marked on any of the maps, which meant someone was venturing into restricted backcountry areas. I decided to follow the tracks, keeping my distance. As I moved, the forest thickened, branches scraping against my jacket, the ground uneven and rocky. The sunlight was fading faster than I expected, and the shadows between trees grew long and dark. Eventually, I came to a bend in the ridge and looked down into a small hollow. The tracks led straight to an old cabin, mostly hidden by thick pine. Its roof sagged in places, the windows were broken, and smoke curled faintly from a chimney. Whoever had been here wasn't expecting visitors. They'd left in a hurry, but a few items were scattered near the doorway: a cooler, some camping gear, a backpack. I approached cautiously, scanning for wildlife or human presence. The cooler had food and a few water bottles, but no one was around. It was clear someone had been camping illegally. The cabin itself was unstable, the floorboards rotting, but I managed to step inside. Inside, old furniture lay in disarray, and I could see signs of makeshift repairs. There were footprints in the dirt floor, and I noted the direction they led: out the back and toward a trail that wound further into the forest. By the time I finished inspecting the cabin, the sun had set, leaving only the faint glow of my flashlight. The temperature dropped quickly, and I knew I needed to find a safe place to spend the night. I set up my small tent a few hundred feet from the cabin, close enough to monitor it, but far enough to be safe. I cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, double-checked my gear, and set an anchor stake for my radio, so I could signal in case of emergency. The night was quiet, the only sounds the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant animal. I didn't sleep well. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the underbrush made me tense. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the ridge behind me. I froze, listening. They weren't heavy, like a bear or elk, but deliberate and careful. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the ridge. No one was there. I waited, holding my breath, until the sound faded into the night. Morning came slowly, pale light filtering through fog. I packed up camp and returned to the cabin to document my findings, taking photos of the tracks, the cabin, and the scattered gear. On my way back to the station, I followed the illegal trail as far as I could safely go before turning back. Once I reached my truck, I reported everything to my supervisor, including the cabin location, tracks, and items left behind. Over the next few days, a small team of rangers investigated. They confirmed the site had been used by a group who had been poaching small game and riding illegally in restricted areas. Nothing violent had occurred, but it was a serious breach of park rules. By the end of that week, the area was secured and patrols increased. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that my observation and caution had helped prevent further damage to the forest and kept the park safer. That season, I learned something important. The wilderness is unpredictable, and being vigilant, patient, and methodical can make all the difference. You never know what you'll find, and sometimes the scariest moments aren't about the supernatural. They're about being alone, alert, and responsible for the wild around you. That patrol stayed with me for years. Every time I returned to that ridge, now free of trespassers, I remembered the cold night, the cabin hidden in the trees, and the realization that vigilance and care were as vital as any weapon or tool a ranger could carry. The forest had tested me, and I'd passed, not through luck, but by paying attention and respecting the land I was entrusted to protect. I started my first summer as a park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana in 2008. I was 24 at the time, fresh out a 2-year seasonal ranger program in Wyoming. The park district I was assigned to covered over 50,000 acres of rugged forest, rivers, and high mountain ridges. Most of the time, I worked alone. The nearest ranger station with more than one person was over an hour away on gravel roads that twisted through valleys and over ridges. I was assigned to patrol a section of the park that included a mix of old logging roads, hiking trails, and a handful of remote backcountry campsites. I remember that June was unusually hot and dry. The pine needles had turned brittle, and the creek beds were low, exposing stones that normally hid beneath clear water. My job included monitoring for wildfire risks, checking campsites for illegal activity, and sometimes just walking the trails to make sure everything was in order. Most of my days started before dawn, packing a backpack with water, maps, binoculars, a first aid kit, and my standard ranger tools, radio, notebook, and a good old compass in case my GPS failed. One morning, I left the station at 5:30 a.m., heading toward a trail that ran along the edge of a steep canyon. The trail was rarely used except by experienced hikers and hunters, and it hadn't been maintained in over a decade. While I got there, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the old logging road that paralleled the trail. The tracks weren't deep, but they were recent, likely from an ATV. I knew that ATVs were technically not allowed on those trails, but I wasn't surprised. People often ignore the rules in the backcountry. I decided to hike in a few miles to check the campsites along the canyon edge. The sun had risen higher by the time I reached the first small clearing. It was a perfect little campsite tucked between a grove of firs and a boulder-strewn slope. The fire pit had been used recently, but the campers had packed out most of their trash, leaving only a small bag of food scraps. I recorded the site in my notebook and moved on, noticing the tracks seemed to be heading further into the backcountry. Around midday, the temperature was climbing above 85 degrees, and the wind had picked up. I came to a narrow ridge that overlooked the canyon floor. From above, I could see the creek snaking through the valley, half dried but still alive with pools of water. That's when I noticed something unusual. Near a cluster of large boulders, I saw a small figure. At first, I thought it might be a hiker, but the figure wasn't moving like a hiker normally would. It was crouched over something. My first thought was that it could be an injured animal or perhaps someone trying to hide. I carefully made my way down the slope, staying low to avoid startling whatever it was. When I got closer, I realized it was a man, maybe in his 30s, sitting on a rock. He looked disoriented and dehydrated. There was a small backpack next to him, half open, and a bottle of water lying on its side. He had clearly been struggling to make it through the heat. I approached slowly, identifying myself as a park ranger, and offered him water. He took it gratefully and drank almost half the bottle at once. He explained, in broken sentences, that he had been hiking alone, misjudged the distance, and had gotten lost after trying to follow a trail that wasn't on his map. He had been wandering for hours and was running low on water. I checked his backpack. It contained minimal supplies, a phone with no signal, and a small map that he hadn't used effectively. I radioed the ranger station to let them know I had located a lost hiker and gave them my coordinates. They instructed me to stay with him until a vehicle could reach us from the main road. While we waited, I set up a small shade area using a tarp from my pack to shield him from the sun. I offered him more water and some energy bars I carried for myself. I also checked him for injuries. He had scrapes from falling on a rocky trail, but nothing serious. I reassured him that help was coming and that he was going to be fine. It took almost 2 hours for a ranger vehicle to reach us. The approach was slow because the old road was rough full of loose rocks and steep inclines. When the vehicle finally arrived, the man's relief was obvious. He could barely walk, but he was alert and safe. I helped load him into the back of the truck and made sure he had plenty of water for the ride back to the ranger station. By the time we reached the station, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The man was reunited with his family, who had been notified after he was reported missing. I filled out my report, detailing the location, the condition of the hiker, and the state of the trails and roads. Later that night, I drove back along the same route I had taken that morning. The forest was quiet, the wind rustling through the trees, the creek reflecting the last light of the sun. I thought about how easily someone could get into serious trouble in the backcountry if they weren't prepared, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that my training, patience, and attention to detail had made the difference that day. That summer taught me a lot about responsibility and vigilance. I continued my patrols, always aware of the terrain, weather, and the unpredictable nature of the backcountry. It also reinforced why ranger work isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about being ready to step in and protect people when nature and circumstance put them at risk. By the end of that season, I had logged dozens of miles of trail, helped several lost or injured hikers, and witnessed firsthand the quiet but intense beauty of the Bitterroot Wilderness. It was exhausting work, but there was no better feeling than knowing that someone owed their safety and possibly their life to the decisions I made that day. I started my first full season as a park ranger in 2011, stationed at a small but rugged national park in northeastern Oregon. I was 27, freshly out of the forest management program at college, and eager to prove myself in the field. The park itself wasn't huge, maybe a little over 30,000 acres, but it had everything a nature lover could hope for. Dense conifer forests, scattered rivers, a few small lakes, and stretches of steep, rocky ridges. Most visitors came in the summer, and the job involved a mix of routine maintenance, enforcing park rules, and sometimes responding to emergencies when people underestimated how wild the area could be. I remember one particular week in August when the weather had been unusually hot and dry. Fires weren't uncommon in the region, so part of my job was to patrol high-risk areas and check that campers were following fire restrictions. One morning, I started my shift at 6 a.m., driving out from the ranger station in my old, scratched-up pickup. The sun was just rising, cutting through mist that clung low in the valleys, and the air smelled sharply of pine and dust. I had a long day ahead, trail inspections, river crossings, checking the backcountry campsites, and some general maintenance. By mid-morning, I was hiking along a narrow ridge trail I'd done dozens of times before. It was quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. The trail was narrow, bordered by steep drop-offs on one side and dense undergrowth on the other, and I had to watch my step constantly. I was carrying my standard ranger pack, water, snacks, first aid kit, GPS, radio, and a couple of trail repair tools, when I noticed something unusual down near the river below. There was a small cloud of dust rising intermittently, as if someone or something had walked through the riverbed recently. Curious, I carefully made my way down the slope, keeping my footing on loose gravel and fallen branches. As I approached the river, I realized that the dust was coming from a pair of hikers' footprints. The prints were fresh and led up a narrow side trail that disappeared into a stand of dense pines. It wasn't uncommon for people to leave a trail, but this particular area had a history of hikers getting lost or injured. I decided to follow the tracks cautiously, moving slowly, scanning for anything that might indicate trouble. The trail was barely more than a faint line in the forest, and after about 20 minutes of careful walking, I saw the source of the disturbance. A young man had slipped and fallen near a small rock outcrop. He was sitting on the ground, one leg twisted awkwardly, grimacing in pain. His backpack was a few feet away, and, judging by the supplies, he had been trying to hike alone with minimal experience. I could see that he had likely been walking for hours without rest or adequate water. I radioed the station to report the situation, giving GPS coordinates and a description of the hiker's condition. While waiting for backup and the ambulance team, I made sure he was comfortable, offered water, and examined his ankle. It wasn't broken, but he had a severe sprain that would make walking impossible without assistance. I cleared a small area for him to sit, stabilized his leg as best as I could, and kept him calm. The forest was hot and dry, and I knew that if I left him alone, he might try to walk and worsen the injury. Eventually, my partner arrived with the rescue pack, and together we secured the hiker with a splint and stretcher. The hike back to the main trail was slow and careful, requiring several short rests along the way. We navigated rocky paths, dense undergrowth, and river crossings, constantly alert for loose footing. By the time we reached the ambulance waiting at the parking area, the hiker was exhausted but grateful. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail, and I felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. Later, back at the ranger station, I completed the incident report and cleaned my gear. I thought about how easy it would have been for someone less experienced or less cautious to have suffered a serious injury, or worse. The park was beautiful, wild, and unforgiving, and my job wasn't just about enforcing rules or fixing trails. It was about keeping people safe in an environment they often underestimated. That night, I sat on the small porch of the station, drinking cold water and watching the last light fade from the mountains. The forest was quiet, except for the distant call of a hawk and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a deep sense of connection to the place, an understanding that being a ranger wasn't about heroics or adventure in the cinematic sense. It was about vigilance, patience, and the quiet knowledge that someone's safety could depend entirely on your attention to detail. From that day on, I made it a personal rule to double-check every trail, to note every potential hazard, and to always carry extra water and first aid supplies, even when I thought a route was easy. The experience reinforced that being a park ranger was as much about preparation and foresight as it was about reacting to emergencies. By the end of the season, I had helped dozens of hikers, repaired miles of trail, and navigated countless stretches of forest alone. Each day reinforced the idea that the park demanded respect, not just from visitors, but from the people tasked with protecting it. When I finally left that ranger post at the end of the season, I carried with me a clear sense of accomplishment. I had witnessed firsthand the unpredictable nature of the wilderness, the fragility of human endurance, and the importance of steady, careful work. That season stayed with me, not for dramatic rescues or heroic feats, but for the quiet knowledge that preparedness, awareness, and respect for the land could make the difference between a routine day and a serious accident. And in a job like that, sometimes the quiet victories were the most important ones of all. I started working as a seasonal park ranger in the Northern Cascades back in 2011, just after I turned 23. The park I was assigned to was remote, almost wild in its scale, with rivers that cut through dense fir forests and trails that led to ridges where you could see nothing but mountains stretching forever. I had grown up hiking, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer isolation of that place. My station was tucked at the edge of a small lake, a solitary cabin with solar power that barely kept lights on at night, and a single trail leading into the interior of the park that saw very few visitors. Most of the time, I was alone, and the quiet was so deep it pressed against your ears. One summer morning, I woke early to check the back trails. I was carrying a backpack with standard gear, first aid, maps, water, and a radio, but I also had a small pack of trail maintenance tools. The night before, there had been a report of downed branches along a seldom-used loop that led to a ridge called Elk Hollow. The trail was steep, narrow, and lined with thick undergrowth. I started out just as the sun broke through the mist rising off the lake. The air was cold, the smell of damp pine heavy, and the forest was alive with the subtle movements of deer and squirrels. The trail was rougher than I remembered. Fallen trees had formed natural barricades, and loose rocks made footing tricky. I had to wedge myself between tree trunks and step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. After about 2 hours, I reached a section where the path disappeared under a thick jumble of ferns and moss. The smell of wet earth was overpowering, and I could hear the muffled sound of a small creek running nearby. I paused to check my map and GPS. Everything was correct, but the trail ahead wasn't obvious. I decided to follow the creek uphill, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. As I went, I noticed signs of wildlife, fresh bear tracks, rabbit holes, and claw marks on trees. It reminded me why I always carry bear spray. A few hundred yards in, I came across a section of the bank that had recently collapsed and rocks and dirt had slid into the creek, creating a small but forceful current. I tested the bank before stepping across, making sure it could hold my weight. One wrong step and I could end up in cold, fast water. The climb continued, and the forest grew denser. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, and the air became heavier with moisture. I finally emerged at a ridge that offered a partial view of the valley below. From there, I could see the path winding back down, but it was littered with debris from last night's storm. There were broken branches, mudslides, and a few large trees that had fallen across the trail. I realized that clearing the path would take hours and that I might not finish before nightfall. I decided to mark the hazards with bright flagging tape, so hikers later in the week wouldn't walk into danger. As I worked, I noticed a small group of elk grazing a little further down the slope. They were calm, unaware of my presence, and I stayed crouched behind a bush to watch them. The silence was profound. You could hear the wind moving through the trees, water dripping from leaves, the occasional crack of a distant branch. I always loved moments like this, the way nature felt endless and intimate at the same time. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in and the temperature dropped quickly. I packed up my flagging tape and began the descent, careful to retrace my steps. At one point, I slipped on moss-covered rock and fell hard on my side. My backpack shifted and I scraped my arm on a jagged edge of bark. Nothing broken, just bruises and scrapes. I took a few moments to catch my breath, checked my GPS, and continued slowly, making sure every step was deliberate. I reached the lake as the last rays of sunlight touched the water, turning it into molten gold. The solitude of the day, the physical effort, and the constant awareness of my surroundings left me exhausted but satisfied. I cleaned my scrapes by the cabin, changed into dry clothes, and prepared a simple meal. As I sat on the porch watching the stars come out, I reflected on the day. There had been danger, sure, but nothing I hadn't expected. No sudden wildlife attacks, no mysterious noises, just the raw challenge of wilderness. I made a note in the ranger log about the fallen trees and the marked hazards. I reported that part of the trail would need a maintenance crew with chainsaws later in the week. I felt a quiet pride knowing that even in isolation, my work mattered. Someone would come through that trail and be safer because I had taken the time to assess and mark it. By nightfall, the lake was calm, the forest quiet but alive, and I felt at peace. I went to bed in my cabin, tired, dirty, and content. The next morning, I would continue my patrols, face more challenges, and manage hazards that came with the seasons. But for that evening, I allowed myself the satisfaction of a job done well. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't a story anyone would tell at a party, but it was real, it was meaningful, and it reminded me why I had become a ranger. To be part of a place that didn't need me to dominate it, just to help it remain safe for others. I had been a park ranger in the northern reaches of Montana for just over 5 years, stationed at a small, relatively isolated district that covered rugged forest land, steep ridges, and a handful of remote trails that hardly saw any visitors outside of summer. In the summer of 2019, I was 28 years old, still fairly new to the solitude and unpredictability of this park. My station was a modest cabin tucked near the edge of a large pine grove, where the sunlight only reached in patches and mornings began with fog so thick it felt like walking through water. I had grown up camping in the Rockies, so the environment wasn't unfamiliar, but living there alone was different. Every sound, every snap of a branch felt amplified, and every shadow seemed to hide possibilities. It was a late July morning when I received my first indication that something unusual was happening. The air had that dry, pine-scented quality typical of early summer, and the sun had just started spilling over the ridges when I began my routine patrol along the East Ridge Trail. The trail was rarely used, mostly because it was long and rough, and I often felt like I had the entire stretch of forest to myself. On this particular morning, however, I noticed a series of fresh tire tracks cutting across a narrow dirt path that wasn't meant for vehicles. They were deep, heavy, and inconsistent with the kind of tracks left by park maintenance or my own patrol vehicle. My chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with that ranger instinct to notice anything out of place. I spent the next couple of hours following the trail of tire marks, weaving through dense pines, overgrown brush, and jagged rock formations. The forest was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant calls of ravens circling overhead. As I followed the tracks, I noticed other signs: discarded water bottles, flattened underbrush, and faint footprints alongside the tire marks. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They had been exploring, possibly looking for something deeper in the forest. My experience told me that people who went off-trail in these conditions were often unprepared for the terrain. I knew the ridge well enough to recognize that straying from the marked path could easily turn dangerous. Around noon, the trail led me to a small clearing I knew well from previous hikes. There was a shallow stream running through it, and the sunlight glinted off the water in patches, illuminating a mess that looked out of place. A tarp had been draped over a pile of branches, some cans, and remnants of a fire. The scene told me someone had camped here recently, and, judging by the freshness of the footprints, it hadn't been long. I examined the area carefully. The fire pit had been extinguished poorly, and there were faint markings in the dirt that suggested someone had been trying to conceal something. I didn't panic, but I noted everything meticulously. This was my job, and every detail could matter later. By mid-afternoon, I decided to backtrack and investigate the ridge above the clearing. The climb was steep, and the rocks were loose, but the vantage point at the top gave me a clearer view of the surrounding forest. That's when I noticed the vehicle responsible for the tracks, partially hidden behind a stand of pines. It was a small off-road truck, its paint scratched and covered in dust, as if it had been driven recklessly for miles. No one was in sight. My mind raced, considering all the possibilities: hikers lost in the forest, poachers, or someone intentionally avoiding detection. I marked the location on my GPS and took photographs, knowing that reporting this accurately would be important if law enforcement or park management needed to investigate. I didn't approach the truck at first. I knew the risks of encountering an unknown person who might panic or act unpredictably. Instead, I spent the next couple of hours carefully circling the area, noting additional signs of human activity, like more discarded packaging and footprints leading further into the forest. By evening, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped quickly, the forest taking on that blue, shadowed quality that always made me more alert. I decided to return to the cabin before dark. Once I was back, I filed a detailed report and shared it with my supervisor. The next morning, park law enforcement came out to inspect the truck and the surrounding area. It turned out that the vehicle belonged to a group of amateur geocachers who had ventured off trail to retrieve a hidden cache. They had gotten stuck and, in their haste to move through the dense forest, had left a mess that could have easily been mistaken for something more sinister. They were fined for their disregard of park rules and the potential hazards they created. But fortunately, no one was hurt and nothing illegal was involved. The incident stuck with me not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me of the thin line between adventure and risk in wilderness areas. I spent the next few weeks checking that section of the forest regularly, clearing debris left by hikers, repairing minor trail damage, and ensuring that anyone who went off trail had clear warnings posted. By late August, the ridge was quiet again, the forest returning to its natural rhythm. Birds nested undisturbed. Deer crossed the clearing at dawn, and the stream ran clean and clear. It was a relief, a return to normalcy that reminded me why I loved this job. The forest could be unpredictable, but with careful observation and respect for its power, it remained a place of beauty and balance. By the end of that summer, I had learned more about patience, vigilance, and the importance of clear documentation. It wasn't a story of danger narrowly avoided or heroic rescue. It was a story of awareness, responsibility, and the small victories that come from keeping both visitors and the wilderness safe. That experience shaped how I approached every patrol afterward, and I carried that lesson with me through every foggy morning, every sunlit ridge, and every quiet, untouched clearing I had the privilege of watching over. I started as a park ranger in the northern reaches of Idaho back in the summer of 2007. I was 25 at the time, fresh out of a local college program for forestry and wildlife management, and eager to prove myself. The district I was assigned to was small but rugged, dense forest, steep hills, and a scattering of trails that were barely maintained. The nearest town was about an hour and a half by dirt roads, and in the winter, sometimes more. I remember thinking how isolated it felt the first day I drove the winding Forest Service road up to the guard station. It was an old wooden cabin built in the early 50s, perched on a ridge with a view of the river valley below. When I first arrived, the air was sharp and smelled like pine and damp earth, and the sound of the wind through the trees was constant. The job itself was straightforward but exhausting. I was responsible for patrolling trails, maintaining signs, checking for illegal activities, and making sure campers and hikers stayed safe. There were stretches of the forest that hadn't seen a human in weeks. Some of the old logging roads had disappeared entirely under brush, and my job sometimes meant just driving or hiking into areas that weren't on any official map. It was both beautiful and grueling. One July afternoon, about 2 months into my first season, I was assigned to check a trailhead near a small lake called Beaver Hollow. The lake wasn't on most maps. It was just a local secret, a quiet spot surrounded by thick stands of fir and cedar. It was hot, the kind of summer day where sweat soaks your shirt before you even make it out of the cabin. I packed my day bag with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a radio, and a topo map and headed out in the ranger truck. The road leading to the lake was narrow, dirt and gravel, flanked by trees that formed a near solid wall of green. When I arrived, I found the area empty, which was not unusual for a weekday. I parked near the trailhead, locked the truck, and began hiking down the narrow path that led around the lake's eastern edge. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird and the buzzing of insects. As I walked, I noticed evidence of campers. Ash from fire pit, a few scattered cans, some footprints, but everything looked abandoned and weeks old. Nothing seemed out of place, but I made a mental note to remind people about fire safety and litter. I continued along the path, which curved inland along a small stream. About half a mile in, I noticed something strange on the ground. There were tracks, animal tracks, but oddly arranged, almost like someone had been walking in a pattern. They were large, maybe a bear, but the spacing was inconsistent, as if someone had walked alongside it. I paused and looked around. The underbrush was thick, and the forest felt quieter, heavier somehow. Not menacing, but weighty. I knew this section of forest well enough to recognize that bears were common, but usually they avoided people entirely. I followed the tracks cautiously, keeping my radio close. They led me off the main trail and into a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy. In the clearing, I found an old tarp stretched between two trees, weighed down by logs, forming a crude shelter. Nearby, there were remnants of food, discarded cans, wrappers, and some charred pieces of wood. It was clear someone had been living here temporarily, or at least hiding out. The site was neat, not chaotic, like someone had been careful not to leave too much behind. I called it in to my supervisor, explaining the location and situation. He advised me to leave it undisturbed and patrol the area more regularly until we could figure out if anyone was living there illegally. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to expect. I circled the clearing slowly, noting the tracks leading in and out, then headed back to the main trail. Over the next few weeks, I returned to that clearing multiple times. Sometimes there were new signs of occupancy, a fresh fire ring, footprints, or small bundles of clothing, but no one was ever there when I arrived. I started leaving small notes on trees, marking dates and times, just to keep a record. The pattern became clear. Someone was using this hidden spot during weekdays when the lake was empty, avoiding weekends when campers arrived. By late August, I finally spotted movement. I was hiking along the lake in the early morning, mist hanging low over the water, when I saw a figure near the edge of the forest. They were moving carefully, carrying a small pack, and immediately vanished into the trees when they noticed me. I followed at a distance, careful not to alarm them. They led me back to the same clearing. This time, I saw that the shelter was more elaborate, with a tarp and some canvas panels forming walls. There was a small solar panel tucked into the undergrowth and a bucket with fresh water from the stream. I watched for a few minutes, then returned to the ranger station to report my observations. My supervisor and I decided on a measured approach. We couldn't just force someone out if they weren't breaking serious laws, but we could monitor and ensure safety. Over the next month, patrols increased, and we documented the person's comings and goings. Eventually, I learned through coordination with local authorities that the person was an older man, living off the grid after losing his home in town. He wasn't dangerous. He was just avoiding society and had chosen a quiet, remote place. By early September, the man moved on, leaving the clearing tidy and mostly undisturbed. I made one last visit before the season ended. The clearing was silent and empty, sunlight filtering through the trees in the late afternoon. There was a faint smell of smoke lingering, and the footprints had faded, but everything else was back to the way nature intended. I sat for a moment on a fallen log, watching the lake shimmer in the distance, feeling the quiet that only comes from being completely alone in the forest. It was a strange, peaceful ending. That summer taught me a lot about patience, observation, and understanding people as well as nature. Being a park ranger isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about knowing the land, respecting it, and sometimes quietly watching over the people who pass through it. By the time I left that station at the end of the season, I had a deeper respect for both the forest and the small, hidden lives that can exist within it, unseen by most but part of the ecosystem in their own way.